Chapter 287. Death Battle. The moment their eyes met, Lenivas suddenly ducked and rolled forward. Clang! A tarot card with an angel and trumpet shot out sharply like a dagger, embedding itself into the wall of the sewer, and its position was at the same height as Lenivas's neck just moments before. Clang! 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 Lenivas either rolled, jumped to his side, or threw himself forward, nimbly avoiding the three cards that came in succession with abnormal agility. Their collision with the walls, slabs, and concrete echoed like metal striking a wall. Meanwhile, out of the corner of his eye, he saw that the man in the clown mask was following him closely, not much slower than he was. In his hand was a thick stack of cards as he launched them with great familiarity and skill. On the surface of an approaching card was a sun with 5 facial features. With his left hand, Lenivas propped himself up against the wall and leaped into the air, drastically changing his course. At that moment, he heard a swishing sound before suddenly feeling a sharp pain in his ankle. He launched 2 cards. One arrived slightly late and was aimed in the direction I was escaping in. Can he foresee my movements? The moment he landed on the ground, Lenivas endured the pain and rolled once again. Clang! Another tarot card embedded itself into his original position, resonating constantly in response to the impact. It was only then that Lenivas noticed a card deeply embedded in his right ankle. The card depicting stars, water containers, and holy water stained in red. So. Lenivas didn't even have the luxury of time to think or treat his injuries. One after another, the cards turned into seemingly sharp flying daggers, shooting at different parts of his body. Very soon, the injuries on his right leg and chest, and the remnant effects from the hole in his chest, as well as the prior demigod-level clash caused this Sequence 9 Marauder to turn sluggish. This was in contrast to the nimbleness and speed that Marauders were known for. Pow! He sent a card flying, but a deep laceration tore through his wrist, one that kept bleeding profusely. The Nighthawks and the military will be coming soon. I can't delay any longer. At this moment, Lenivas's mind was very clear. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks and stopped dodging, allowing a card depicting the devil to strike him squarely in the neck. In almost an instant, the cards sticking out from his body were sent flying. The hideous wounds on his neck, right chest, wrist, and ankle were all squirming madly, sprouting one meat tendril after another in disgusting shapes. On his skin, numerous small goosebumps appeared. These goosebumps had a metallic tint to them as if they had turned into a set of armor. Clang! A tarot card was shot over, but it was deflected by the fine goosebumps. With bloodshot eyes, Lenivas stared at the clown who had put away his cards after coming to a halt. He said, half laughing and half mocking, "No matter what, after being tormented by a deity, one will always get something in return." Before he could finish his words, he had already jumped over the polluted waters in the canal with his left foot, throwing himself at the enemy opposite him. As if expecting this, Klein stepped to the side, pulled his left hand out of his pocket, clenched it into a fist, and threw it at Lenivas's temple. Bam! Lenivas swung his elbow sideways and raised his forearm, accurately hitting his opponent's fist. The explosive force surged like a torrential tide, causing Klein's body to move from the impact as he staggered a little. Pa! 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 Crisp explosive blasts sounded in Klein's ear. Punches, each heavier and faster than the last, constantly reflected into his eyes. The flurry of attacks made him seem to forget to maintain his balance. He staggered and fell to the side, then with the support of his left elbow, he rolled in a different direction. Smack! 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 Bang! 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 Lenivas's punches and kicks came quickly and furiously, almost hitting Klein quite a few times, but thanks to his exaggerated balance and movements that defied common sense, he managed to dodge successfully. At times, he would be on the wall and at other times, on the ground. It was as though he was performing an acrobatic act. He appeared very calm without the slightest bit of impatience. It was as though he had decided to drag out the battle as long as possible until the Nighthawks and the military arrived. And once there were any signs of Lenivas's attempting to escape, he was hell-bent on pestering him and not give him an opportunity to do so. Pa! Lenivas's punch forced Klein to use the rebound from the wall to fly back into the air, and as for him himself, he didn't hesitate to turn around and flee towards another tunnel. The moment Klein's toes touched the ground, his body shot out like a cannonball as he pounced straight for Lenivas's back. At that moment, an image appeared in his mind. It seems as if Lenivas has no bones. I should force him to twist his upper body and land a punch on his body. This was a clown's intuition. Without any doubts or hesitation, Klein took the initiative to reduce his subsequent strength. With a smacking sound, he still threw himself forward, but it was much weaker than he expected. Gotcha! With a jarring noise, Lenivas twisted his upper body suddenly while his legs remained immobile. His face faced backward as his toes pointed forward. In such a terrifying scene, Lenivas threw a punch towards Klein's head. The force of the punch was so strong that even the air produced an explosive boom. Boom! His fist hit nothing but air, and his fist was still 20 or 30 centimeters from Klein's face. The winds that stirred from the punch blew through Klein's hair, but he didn't take the opportunity to attack the enemy. Instead, he croaked a single word in ancient Hermes, crimson. A charm. Lenivas scrunched his face as he immediately jumped to the side in a bid to dodge the impending attack. However, Klein had yet to throw out the charm. Instead, he clenched his left fist tightly and followed in the direction of Lenivas. He similarly threw himself to the side and rolled on the ground as well, causing the distance between them to only widen slightly. It was a bluff? Just as this thought flashed through his mind, the highly raised corners of the clown's mouth were clearly reflected in his eyes. There was also a dark red flame which had unknowingly ignited in the clown's left fist. This. Lenivas's gaze immediately froze. A light crackling sound entered his ears, and a calm, tranquil feeling emanated instantly, enveloping him and Klein. What is he trying to do? He wants both of us to be affected at the same time, to allow for the Nighthawks and military to rush here in time. Lenivas's eyelids drooped heavily, and the fatigue and weakness he had been suppressing began to rear their heads uncontrollably. He did his best not to fall asleep, hoping to rely on the uniqueness of his body to endure through the most intense period of the charm's slumbering effects. As for Klein, he didn't choose to resist at all and quickly entered a deep slumber. However, whenever he fell asleep unnaturally, he would instinctively wake up. This was the unique thing about him when fighting mediumship and dream invasions. This was the reason why he had been lucky enough to escape from the hands of Madame Sharon back in Tingen. In the fight just now, after throwing his cards proved ineffective, he immediately took out the slumber charm and gripped it tightly in his palm, waiting for the opportunity to affect himself and his enemy. In just a split second, he forcibly broke free from the abnormal state of mind in his dream. The figure of the staggering Lenivas was clearly reflected in his eyes. Phew! Klein suddenly became very calm, as though what was before him was nothing but a target. He took a deep breath, turned his waist, and pulled back his shoulder before thrusting his fist forward with all his strength. Bam! Gotcha! His fist landed ruthlessly at Lenivas's throat, breaking his bones and splattering his flesh. Lenivas took 2 steps back and leaned against the wall. That intense pain finally allowed him to extricate himself from the slumbering effects, but the fine iron-colored goosebumps on his body were all gone. After Klein's punch landed, he reached into his pocket with his left hand and pulled out 2 cards. So. The 2 cards each stabbed into an eye as scarlet liquid gushed out. Lenivas surprisingly endured the pain without letting out a tragic cry. Instead, he abruptly threw himself forward in a bid to make his last stand. Klein didn't take advantage of the situation to attack. Having long expected this, he turned his body to the side and took a step back. Right on the heels of that, while seizing the moment when Lenivas's fell forward, he took 2 steps and arrived behind him. He reached out with his arms and grabbed his enemy's neck. Gotcha! Klein's arms exerted force, and he suddenly turned around, twisting Lenivas's neck. After doing all of this, he took 2 steps back and looked at his enemy. With the card embedded in him, Lenivas looked ahead weakly as he slumped to the ground. At the same time, he was very confused and asked in a staccato manner, "Why? Do you want to kill me?" With his clown mask on, Klein stared at his archenemy and replied indifferently, "No reason." "No." With his eyes wide open, Lenivas collapsed to the ground in the sewers, unable to accept his fate. Finally, his breathing came to a stop. At that moment Klein, who seemed to be extremely calm, suddenly stepped forward, tightened his right leg, and with all his strength, kicked him in the head. Bam! His neck, which was already badly mutilated, could no longer bear the pressure and was sent flying like a rubber ball. It slammed heavily into the wall, creating a red and white patch. Upon seeing this scene, Klein suddenly crouched down. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. He laughed crazily with a suppressed voice. The clown mask looked so very happy. The corners of those raised lips, the bright red nose, and that white face wore a very happy expression. Ha 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 ha. Ha ha. Klein laughed so much that he went out of breath. His laughter was more jarring than crying. After a few seconds, he finally calmed down. He slowly straightened his body and winked with his left eye at the darkest part of the sewer. Then, he smirked and muttered to himself, "Captain? Look, we've saved Lone once again." Droplets of liquid quietly slid down and landed on his collar. At that moment, he felt that his clown potion had been digested completely. Chapter 288. A scene filled with symbolism in the dark sewer. Klein wiped his neck and turned his attention back to Lenevis's cracked head and decapitated body before turning to the 2 tarot cards that were stuck in Lenevis's eyes. He originally wanted to retrieve all the projectiles that he had thrown and wipe the scene of any clues. However, he realized a very real and extremely serious problem. He didn't have the vision to see in complete darkness. He had relied on his spirit vision to rush through the pitch-black sewers and engage in the intense battle with Lenevis. He could see the colors of Lenevis's aura, the spirituality radiance of all sorts of critters, and could faintly use the light's illumination to distinguish the path. Unfortunately, the tarot cards he was currently using weren't the same as the ones that had originated from the Nighthawks. It didn't have any spirituality or silver engravings, and it was completely ordinary with no special characteristics. In such an environment, Klein could use his own aura's color and spirituality radiance to create a tiny radius around him where he could distinguish things. However, he couldn't see the cards stuck in the walls and ground, as well as the cards that had scattered everywhere. In the intense battle with Lenevis, they hadn't restricted themselves to a particular spot. Of course, he believed that as long as he had enough time, it wouldn't be difficult to find all the cards he had thrown out. But the main problem was that the Nighthawks and the military on board the airship would arrive at any minute. "I can't be too careless regarding this. I've been wearing gloves all this time." This deck of tarot cards was bought before coming to Backlund and is standard across the nation. I don't usually use it. Most of the time, even if I have it with me, it's placed together with Mr. Azek's copper whistle. Regardless of what methods are used, it would be very difficult to locate me through them. At most, they would be able to restore a portion of the battle scene. I donned a mask, and my shoes are padded. All sorts of thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, and he quickly came to a decision. He turned to the headless corpse and crouched down. Reaching out with his black-gloved right hand, he quickly searched for any items left behind. Klein didn't have the intention of carrying out a mediumship ritual. Firstly, the feeling of the evil god's descent had left a deep impression on him, so he didn't dare to blindly channel Lenevis's spirit unless he brought it above the gray fog with him. Secondly, with the situation of the Nighthawks and military arriving at any time, he didn't feel that he had enough time to set up the ritual of summoning himself, responding to himself, and then going up above the gray fog and channeling the spirit. I should give up when it's necessary. Klein silently muttered to himself, and he withdrew his hand from Lenevis's body. This crazy swindler seemed to be in a hurry when escaping. He didn't bring any cash, materials, or charms. He only had an eye-sized badge on him which coruscated a faint spirituality radiance. Klein wasn't afraid that this item could be used to locate him as he planned on throwing it above the gray fog later to study it slowly. Therefore, he stood up and put the badge in his pocket. He stole a glance at Lenevis's corpse, and without waiting for the Beyonder characteristic to appear, he used his left black-gloved hand to remove the remaining tarot cards. Then he stretched out his left arm and placed his palm directly above the Lenevis's corpse. All of a sudden, Klein released his grip, allowing the tarot cards to fall, like leaves cascading over the headless corpse. Some of them faced up with pictures and numbers printed on them, whilst others had dark red patterns on their backs. After doing all of this, Klein took out Azek's copper whistle and tossed it a few times. Then, without looking back, he ran deep into the sewers. After almost 2 minutes, figures finally arrived at this place. Some of them were wearing thick black windbreakers, while others were wearing well-tailored military uniforms. The leader of the group was Krestet Sezimir, who was carrying a pure white bone sword. His red gloves were smeared with dust, and his determined face showed obvious signs of fatigue and frailty. They stopped a few meters away from the body, and through the means of their night vision, they could see Lenevis's corpse and his head against the wall. There were 2 tarot cards stuck in his head. One was the Emperor and the other was Wheel of Fortune. The headless body was covered with even more cards, each separately depicting the Chariot, the Hermit, Death, and more cards of different suits comprising of chalice, scepters, etc. On the walls and on the ground around him, there were also tarot cards such as the Devil, the Sun, and Judgment. It all looked like the scene of some bizarre ritual, and Lenivus was the sacrificial offering that was destined to be sacrificed. Crestet Casimir drew a silent gasp as he knitted his brows tightly. The Beyonders around him fell into a momentary daze at the sight of this frightening and mysterious scene in the darkness. Far away from the scene of Lenivus's death, Klein quickly found an exit and left. He took off his clown mask and in the shadows of the gas lamps, walked quickly towards East Borough. Before that, he had already dealt with the stains on the soles of his shoes. It was only when he reached Black Palm Street in the East Borough did he breathe a slight sigh of relief. Then, he quickly held the ritual of summoning himself inside his rented one-bedroom apartment and responded to himself. In his spiritual body state, Klein moved all the clothes he had worn tonight, as well as the remaining charms, herbs and essential oils, as well as the badge he had obtained from Lenivus to the space above the grey fog. Then, he used a spiritual flame to burn the corresponding clues. Phew! He exhaled and finally had time to take a look at what the badge he had taken from Lenivus looked like. This badge was only the size of an eyeball. On the front was a symbol that depicted fate and concealment, and behind it was a ring of tiny and compact words in ancient Hermes. You can join if you have this item. What does it mean? Was Lenivus also a member of some secret organization? Klein rubbed his temples. In a situation where he was physically and mentally exhausted, along with the fact that the timing wasn't right, he decided to give up on his research and leave it till after the Tarot Club's gathering. He quickly left the mysterious space above the grey fog, changed into another set of clothes, and removed his disguise. However, he was in no hurry to return to Minsk Street. He planned to sleep for the night before leaving. This was because it was easy to be inspected after midnight, especially when such an accident had just occurred. He lay down on the bed, looked out the window at the moonlight's encroaching of the darkness, and gradually calmed down. After completing his initial revenge, he felt that he had relieved himself of a lot of his burdens and lost a lot of his pressure. His mental state was clearly much better than before. The present me isn't capable of handling in Zangwil and sealed artifact 0-08. Besides, the gap between us is huge. Only after becoming a high-sequence Beyonder, a demigod, would I have the qualifications to involve myself in such matters. Before advancing to sequence 4, I'll act as though they don't exist. Yeah, for the foreseeable future, my goal is to work hard to improve myself. Now that I've completely digested the clown potion, I can advance to magician once the Beyonder ingredients are gathered. There's still Faceless, Nimble Right Master, and the corresponding sequence for which I don't know the name of. Other than that, I'll just be an ordinary detective. Klein's mind was calm and peaceful, and his thoughts were scattered as he thought about his future arrangements. He was no longer cranky or that depressed. As he thought about it, the corners of his lips curled up slightly as he silently muttered to himself. Captain, Benson, Melissa, I believe all of you would prefer to see me like this. At dawn, a group of people wearing surgical hats and white masks came to the dock union's dormitory. They were all dressed as doctors. The elder in the lead appeared to be rich in experience as he said to the puzzled and confused residents, "We've discovered an infectious disease in this building. A person named Kevin has already passed away because of it. We will provide free treatment. This infectious disease has a special drug, and as long as you take it in time, you'll be fine." Kevin? One by one, the guests exclaimed in astonishment as they looked around for their colleague named Kevin. However, they didn't find him at all. That was Lenivus's alias. Seeing that the charity medical team was accompanied by police officers, the residents no longer had any doubts and began to line up nervously to collect their medicine. The first was a middle-aged man with a bushy beard. He nervously asked all sorts of questions, afraid that a single bottle of medicine wasn't potent enough to fight off the infectious disease. It wasn't until the doctors showed their impatience that he drank the blue bottle of medicine. Then, he was helped to the side and aimed his mouth at a hole that was of the same size. The man suddenly felt nauseous as he violently vomited a putrid blob of a bloody substance. He was about to prop himself up and cast his gaze to see what he had just vomited when two strong nurses yanked him away. The mouth-sized hole was located above an iron-black metal barrel. The bottom of the barrel was dark and deep, with almost no light coming from it. And right there, a pool of yellowish-green liquid was quietly resting at the bottom. In the middle of the pool was a small piece of blood-colored meat. One by one, the residents took the medicine and vomited in front of different metal barrels. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. "Why did you suddenly visit so early?" Audrey looked at the sky outside. Then she looked at Viscount Glaint. Glaint looked around and only found a golden retriever sitting beside him. "Hence," he whispered, "I was planning to go to the turf club, but I met Kantz on the way. He told me something very interesting. It's truly interesting. Since I was passing by here, I thought of coming to share it with you." "What is it?" Audrey asked with interest. Glaint didn't deliberate over his words as he replied. "You should have heard of the Aurora Order, right? It was the Aurora Order that assassinated the Intis ambassador. They were caught, with several important members killed, and a very large ploy was foiled as a result. I thought it was something related to the godhood of the true creator. Zio and Furs sent someone to report the information yesterday evening, and it just so happened that an operation was held last night. Wait, the Aurora Order apparently worships the true creator." Audrey's eyes lit up. She pressed in a reserved tone. "What ploy?" "I don't know," Kantz refused to say. "He just told me that the person in charge of this ploy was once a wanted swindler, a swindler named Lenivis." Glaint spread out his right hand. As expected. Audrey nodded indiscernibly. She didn't conceal her curiosity and asked, "Was he caught?" "He's dead, but he wasn't killed by our people." Glaint paused for a moment. "This is what I meant by interesting. When his body was found, it was covered with many tarot cards. Same for the surroundings. You can imagine that scene. Tarot cards? The body was covered with tarot cards?" Audrey was startled at first before it hit her. "This was done by our tarot club. It was Mr. Fool's adorer." Chapter 289. Conjecture and Investigation. Audrey, who thought she knew the truth, couldn't help but imagine the scene described by Viscount Glaint. Lenivis lying in the mud in the darkness, covered with rows and rows of tarot cards. There's the Fool, Justice, the Hanged Man, the Sun, the World, and the other major arcana cards and numerous numbered cards. They would either be overturned or facing right up, and there would be some left unturned, exposing only their backs, as if they were all part of a large-scale, eerie tarot divination. This kind of scene must be very shocking. I wonder where the card for justice landed. How would the Beyonders of MI9 and the Church view this matter? Would they believe that a new secret organization has appeared? By possessing the godhood of the true creator, the ploy between Lenivis and the Aurora Order must definitely be significant. It definitely would have brought a terrible disaster to Backlund and the kingdom. Yet, this ploy was so easily foiled because of a simple mission Mr. Fool had issued. This is a tussle at the level of deities? Mr. Fool and the true creator are considered archenemies? It's no wonder he calls the other party the fallen creator. Many thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind as her body trembled faintly and imperceptibly. "What are you thinking about?" Viscount Glaint, who was sitting opposite, finally couldn't hold it in any further as he asked in puzzlement. Audrey abruptly snapped out of her reverie. Slightly cocking her head, she smiled and said, "Didn't you tell me to imagine the scene of the corpse being covered with tarot cards?" "Ha ha." Glaint awkwardly smiled and sighed. "I wonder which secret organization's member killed Lenivis. It really matches how I imagine such things to be like. It's so cool." "It's our tarot club," Audrey answered silently as she smiled. "Perhaps there's no organization, but the independent act of a powerful Beyonder? Regardless, I like this style. Urge Zio and Furs and ask them when they can find my apothecary formula," Glaint said in excitement. Audrey widened her eyes slightly. Looking around her, she lowered her voice and said, "Hush, keep it down. How can you talk about potions here?" Glaint gave an indifferent smile. "Don't worry. It's nothing. I had already confirmed that other than you and me, there's only a dog." The huge golden retriever, Susie, unconsciously shifted her position. Northborough in Backlund. Inside a room beneath the St. Samuel Cathedral. Daly, who was wearing a black hooded robe and makeup with blue eyeshadow and red blush, gave off a charming yet cold feeling. She randomly found a seat and picked up the document on the table. She swept through it before her gaze suddenly froze. Her brows immediately furrowed, and she suppressed something as she asked, "Lenivis? Why wasn't I informed of this matter? Why didn't you inform me about the operation last night?" Sitting at the seat of honor, Crestet Sesamir, who had hidden his chin and lips back into his propped-up collar, said deeply, "I was afraid that you wouldn't be able to control your emotions. That would have brought unnecessary danger to the operation, so I didn't get anyone to inform you. I can understand how you feel. A Nighthawk from the Tingen squad is currently undergoing guidance and training at the Holy Cathedral. He plans on joining the Red Gloves, and his performance is about equal to yours. But as the person in charge of the operation, and as a high-ranking deacon of the Nighthawks, I had to eliminate all unstable elements. Daly looked at the other Nighthawk squad captains and deacons, and she sneered. Why do you think I won't be able to control my own emotions? I'm very calm and I won't act rashly. My anger will only erupt after Lenivas is caught. This is the professional bearing of a veteran Nighthawk and a deacon. If I had caught Lenivas, I would let him know that men can be weak too. I would make sure that a cold, rotten yet stiff corpse would be situated behind his buttocks. I would make sure that a pungent white bone filled with thorns would be situated in front of him. I'd make it so that those cold little fellows enter and leave his body wherever they can. Damn it! You actually managed to let him die just like that. Crestet Casimir looked at Daly calmly and sighed after silently listening to her until she was done. How long have you been putting up with it? Daly froze, then muttered in frustration, like a deflated ball. For a very long time. Casimir retracted his gaze and cast them towards the other deacons and captains. Got anything? From our preliminary investigations, the person who killed Lenivas is a member of the Secret Order. A Sequence 8 of the potion name, Clown. He's adept at using paper cards as flying knives. A deacon reported based on the findings. However, we are unable to confirm this guess. The tarot cards scattered across the corpse don't seem like they were concealing something. After all, the Beyonder didn't deal with the cards on the wall and in Lenivas's head. We all believe the final scene was more of a ritual or a symbolism. Therefore, we suspect that the Beyonder might belong to an organization we don't understand. Of course, the scene might also just be a personal preference of his. Casimir nodded slightly and said, we can start from that point and proceed with a follow-up investigation. Ire, any updates on the person who tipped us off? The charming middle-aged man, Ire Harson, flipped the papers in his hand and said, we investigated the person and discovered that his actions were directed by a bounty hunter. In the process of looking for the wanted criminal Lenivas, the Balam's companion was killed by a member of the Aurora Order. In order to exact revenge, she secretly carried out an investigation and eventually locked onto the target at the Workers' Alliance Tavern in East Balam Dock. Based on the target's actions and lifestyle, she discovered Lenivas. Her actions have basically been verified by witnesses. There isn't anything strange about it. We also used Beyonder means to confirm that she has no connection with the person who killed Lenivas. She's in hiding now, and it's very hard to find her. Casimir added while seemingly in thought. This fits very well with Lenivas's description, that the radical and insane members of the Aurora Order were helping him out. Is there any problem with the reporter who did the interview at the Union that afternoon? Another captain of the Nighthawks reported, he was a fake reporter, and according to news from the police department, he's actually a private detective who had previously helped Mike Joseph of the Daily Observer. Joseph was investigating the murder of Sibber. We suspect that he got some kind of lead, found the dock union and disguised himself to get in touch with everyone who was suspected of being the killer. This guess has already been confirmed by Isengard Stanton. Casimir acknowledged it before switching to ask about other people who had recently come into contact with Lenivas, but similarly got answers that there was nothing wrong with them. Towards the end, he said after some deliberation, I'm very confused by the lack of motive for the murder of Lenivas. That mysterious murderer deserves our attention. You should continue to follow up on this matter. In addition, according to common sense, the Aurora Order definitely wouldn't only have Beyonders at the Rose Bishop and Shadow Ascetic level in a big city like Backlund. There should at least be an oracle, or perhaps even a saint. Their ploy of receiving the true Creator's descent has failed. With their crazy and irrational traits, I'm worried that they'll launch a series of retaliatory acts. All of you are to be on high alert in the near future. I'll also be staying in Backlund. Yes, Your Grace, the deacons and captains replied solemnly. Crestet Casimir paused for a few seconds before adding, the events of the Megos incident in Tingen and last night's incident with Lenivas have revealed a problem. The industrial area, the dock area, and East Borough have become hotbeds for the descent and nurturing of evil gods. You are to send people to investigate and gather the truth about the situation. If it truly is as Lenivas had described, I'll raise this matter at the Council of Cardinals, formally exerting pressure on the kingdom and the government to bring about the corresponding changes as soon as possible. Klein slept in and didn't wake up until it was late. However, it still wasn't bright enough outside. The area was still shrouded in fog, making it dark and cold. This doesn't fit with my splendid mood, he grumbled. After changing his clothes and taking his key, he returned to Minsk Street unnoticed. After changing from his worker's uniform to casual home attire, a shirt and sweater, and after confirming that no one came investigating his identity as a private detective, he was completely at ease. He leisurely went out to the butcher and grocery store to buy food in preparation for a sumptuous lunch for himself. There was some afternoon sun in Backland, and Klein lazily basked in its worth, momentarily having no desire to do anything. He waited until 15 minutes to 3, then he took out his golden pocket watch for a glance before returning to the bedroom and going above the grey fog. After conjuring the fake world and familiarizing himself with its controls, he sat down on the high-backed chair at one end of the table and gave a message to the sun that he was to prepare for his participation in the gathering. At precisely 3, according to Backland time, streaks of crimson light soared out of the vast and ancient palace, outlining blurry figures which were equally indistinct. Audrey directly looked towards the seat of honor and said cheerfully, "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. The simple mission you entrusted has been completed." She had deliberately emphasized the word simple, in order to ascertain from Mr. Fool whether Lenivus had really been eliminated by his adorer. She wanted to know if the tarot card-covered death scene was a symbol of the Tarot Club. Klein deliberately acted composed as he said with a smile, "I'm already aware." After saying that, he sighed. In such an age, in such a place like Backland, in such a place in the East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district, they're the hotbeds for an evil god's descent. What? Alger was stunned for a moment, wondering if there was something wrong with his ears. Why would a simple mission involve hotbeds for an evil god's descent? Chapter 290. Affecting change indirectly. I remember that the simple mission given by Mr. Fool was for the sole purpose of examining 2 people for their candidacy of joining the gathering. The general idea was to find the person in the portrait, and that person was confirmed to be in Backland. Alger Wilson tried to remember what had happened the last gathering, and he couldn't understand what it had to do with the hotbed of an evil god's descent. Wasn't it just the search for someone? Furthermore, it was the kind of task which didn't pose much of a threat. Was there a deeper purpose behind Mr. Fool's simple mission? Was this a silent contest between deities? Many thoughts went through the hanged man's mind instantly, and he almost couldn't stop himself from asking justice, tempted to pay in order to understand what exactly was going on. However, as a veteran official beyonder, a seafarer who steered an ancient ghost ship, he was experienced and shrewd. He forcefully suppressed his impulse and planned to go through the internal channels of the Church of the Lord of Storms to find out about the recent events in Backland. As for Audrey, she instantly understood what Mr. Fool's sigh meant. She immediately understood the entire situation regarding Lenivus. So it turns out that the bit of godhood that Lenivus possessed was the basic foundation for the descent of the true creator into the real world. The harsh situation in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory area, however, was a hotbed that provided him rapid nurturing and strengthening. With a simple mission, Mr. Fool stopped the true creator's great conspiracy and saved the whole of Backland. Audrey looked towards the end of the long bronze table, her eyes sparkling brightly. Unconsciously, she brimmed with admiration. At this moment, the gloomy and reserved world let out a chuckle and said, "Yes, every time I see and hear about a large number of child laborers dying in their teens, and how most workers rarely live past 30 due to extreme exhaustion and the terrible environment, or how after barely surviving the previous tests and as a result of their old age and the loss of their jobs, they can only wander the streets and die of hunger and cold, I have no doubt about the existence of an evil god. These gods are on the ground, in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory area. Well, there's even been a report that some factory workers have a hard time surviving 5 years. In the East Borough of Backland, there's a saying that among the people who live there, without exception, any person who's a grandfather must be from the countryside. The meaning of this sentence is that people living there won't have a 3rd generation as they can't have grandchildren. Poverty and hunger make their children very thin. Work that's difficult to adapt to causes them to quickly wither away in Backland, much less getting married and conceiving the next generation. This was the first time Audrey heard Mr. World speak so much. She was suddenly plunged into deep shock and confusion. Why don't I know anything about this? The newspapers and magazines I read only mention that the residents of East Borough are having a hard time. This is far worse than being laborious. Audrey's eyes lost their focus for a moment. She felt as if her understanding of the kingdom and the world had been completely overturned. Suddenly, she understood why Mr. Fool had uttered such a sigh, and why in such an age, such a Backland, in such an East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district were the hotbeds of an evil god's descent. We can't go on like this. Otherwise, Backland will one day be destroyed because of this. Audrey felt a strong urge to go back and learn more, to remind her father, Count Hall. She wanted to use the powers of a spectator and a telepathist to secretly guide the governmental policies that would improve the lives of the pitiful people in East Borough, the docks area, and the factory district. At the end of the long bronze table, Klein quietly observed Miss Justice's reaction. He had purposely lamented a while ago and used his smuff, the world, to give a detailed explanation. He wanted this noble, one who still had a semblance of purity, to realize the seriousness of the problem and use her to push for change in the kingdom. Before I become faceless, I must clearly remember that I cannot be personally involved in such matters. He silently set such a boundary for himself. Thank you, Mr. Fool. Thank you for saving Backlund. Your sigh has made me understand the problem at its roots. Thank you, Mr. World. You have made me understand a great deal of the situation I didn't know in the past. Audrey held back her emotions and sincerely thanked the two gentlemen at the two ends of the table. Saved Backlund? Alger was no stranger to the conditions of East Borough, the factory district, and the dock area. He was more surprised by the description Miss Justice had used. Just how huge was this matter? He thought with an extremely puzzled frown. The son, on the other hand, listened quite attentively, and although he couldn't understand all of it, he still listened attentively, hoping to learn more about the regions where Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and Mr. World were located. Klein only smiled in response to Miss Justice's gratitude and didn't do anything further. He then turned to look at the Hanged Man. Alger immediately understood what he meant, and he quickly conjured the last page of the promised Roselle's diary. Klein received it out of thin air and took a casual glance at it. January 14th. I discovered a problem. If unconscious high-sequence beyonder objects are not sealed, they would unconsciously attract nearby low-sequence beyonders from the same pathway, causing them to come into contact with each other. The higher the original sequence, the more likely that this will happen. However, this situation doesn't seem to be a constant. It seems to be intermittent. This diary entry immediately jolted Klein to attention because he had made similar guesses before. After he came to Backlund, he soon found himself intertwined with the secret order, with a beyonder of the seer pathway, and thus found himself in an extremely passive and extremely dangerous situation. However, he had also obtained the corresponding sequences 7, 6, and 5 potion formulas as a result. At the time, he had suspected that his transmigration involved secrets that gave him the power to resurrect, and that he would occasionally attract people and objects related to the seer pathway, such as the Antigonus family's notebook or members of the secret order. After seeing this diary entry of Emperor Roselle, Klein suddenly had a new idea. He used the corner of his eyes to scan the thick grey fog and the illusory dark red stars below him. He muttered to himself in silence. Could it be that the one who created that attractive force wasn't me, but this grey fog, the mysterious space above the grey fog? This could also be considered as a secret behind my transmigration. Without any further clues or information, Klein quickly gathered his thoughts and read the second diary entry. January 16th, the taste of a demoness still isn't bad. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched, unsure of what expression he should show. Emperor, I have underestimated you. There's really nothing stopping you. Don't you care about the other person's previous gender? Don't you care about her experience during the pleasure phase? Suppressing the urge to exhale, Klein looked at the last entry in the diary in his hands. January 20th. I finished making the second card of blasphemy. Let me think, where should I hide it? Yes, I plan to disguise it as a bookmark and insert it into a very valuable book. If the person who obtains it isn't someone fated, it would be hard to imagine that the most valuable thing in the book is actually that seemingly ordinary bookmark. Not bad, that's a good idea. Emperor, why can't you explain more clearly? Which book did the bookmark go into? Before I read this, I was so happy thinking that I can follow the clues and obtain a card of blasphemy containing the profound secrets of the deities. Klein was disappointed and let his gaze linger on the last paragraph. I hope that there will be more specific information in the future entries of the Emperor's diary. He comforted himself with this sentence, leaned back, and said with a smile, "You can start your discussion freely now." At that moment, the son Derrick raised his hand, having learned it from Miss Justice, and said, "Mr. World, the beyonder weapon you gave me far exceeds my expectations. I've already accumulated enough contribution points to trade for the ingredients to advance to sequence 8. I'll use the remaining contribution points to hire helpers to obtain a chance to obtain the true root and juice of the Miss Treyant. I'll be able to complete the deal soon." He explained in great detail, worried that his reputation of keeping his word would be suspected and destroyed. Of course, he was telling the truth. Although the axe didn't match some of his expectations for a Beyonder weapon, its power shocked him. That axe can create a powerful lightning bolt in just 2 or 3 strikes, and with the temporary boost from my bard's powers, I can easily fight in close quarters with a Sequence 7 monster. If I were to encounter a monster that's afraid of lightning, I could even easily finish it. I'm now a light suppliant with a certain level of magical spells. My strength has been raised qualitatively, and I can fight against even more powerful monsters. Derrick Berg felt that he had fallen in love with that Beyonder weapon. In the City of Silver, its potency was one of the reasons to like it. The surrounding darkness and monsters in the depths of the darkness forced them to obey this rule for generations. All right. The gloomy world nodded under Klein's control. He then looked around and asked again, Ladies, sirs, do you have any clues regarding the dark pattern Black Panther spinal fluid or spring of the elves' marrow crystals? Audrey shook her head without hesitation. After musing for a few seconds, Alger suddenly said, There will be a grand event held on the Sonia Sea soon. Ships from the 4 pirate kings and the 6 pirate admirals will be participating. I should call them the 7 pirate admirals. Another person has joined the ranks. There'll definitely be transactions of Beyonder ingredients at such an event. It's very likely that the not very rare dark pattern Black Panther spinal fluid or spring of the elves' marrow crystals will appear. I have the opportunity to participate in this event, but what can you offer in exchange? I'm sure you don't have the potion formula for Wind Blessed and that it'll be very difficult for you to find it in the future too. Chapter 291. Seller and Notary in one high probability of appearing. Klein controlled the world and made him laugh deeply. Yes, I really don't have the potion formula for Wind Blessed, nor will I have the means to obtain it anytime soon. However, I have an incomplete formula for a Sequence 4 potion. Even though it's incomplete, I think you should know its value very well. It can be exchanged for at least 10,000 gold pounds, and most of the time, you can't even buy it with money worth several times that. This is a crucial step that will lead to a human's qualitative change. So, are you interested? The spinal fluid of a dark pattern Black Panther is worth between 500 and 700 pounds, and the spring of the elves' marrow crystals is between 300 and 400 pounds. I believe you'll still need to prepare an additional 9,000 pounds in cash or an item of equal value. Klein had long since speculated that the sequence of the Sun sequence pathway, unshadowed, could be swapped with the same sequence of the Sailor and Reader pathways, and this conjecture had been indirectly confirmed by Mr. A's request and in the information provided in Roselle's diary. It was even suspected to extend to the secret suppliant and spectator sequence pathways. Therefore, he believed that the incomplete formula of Unshadowed was an irresistible temptation for the hanged man who was from the Sailor pathway. It doesn't matter if you don't have something worth 9,000 pounds for the time being. You can pay it in installments with Mr. Fool bearing witness. Klein silently added. Currently, he was lacking the spinal fluid of a dark pattern Black Panther, so he didn't mind letting the hanged man remain on credit. In any case, he didn't need to worry about the possibility of him running away. Well, there are also latent risks. I would be at a huge disadvantage if Mr. Hanged Man suddenly dies. With such an expensive deal at hand, Klein couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive. The incomplete formula of a Sequence 4 potion? An incomplete formula that leads to the path of a demigod? This is something that you can't even buy with money. Audrey's eyes lit up. She couldn't help hiding her curiosity as she asked before the hanged man could speak, Mr. World, can I ask which Sequence 4 pathway the formula pertains to? If it's not convenient to tell me, pretend I never asked. Mr. World actually has a Sequence 4 potion formula. Even if it's incomplete, it's still very shocking. No wonder Mr. Fool pulled him into the Tarot Club. He isn't a simple Beyonder. Well, Zio's and Furz's test mission has come to an end. Mr. Fool didn't mention if he's letting them join. Well, he must have other considerations, and maybe he needs more time to observe them. I shouldn't take the initiative to ask since it will appear impolite. Many thoughts ran through Audrey's mind at that moment. Miss Justice's question was just what Klein wanted. He made the World reply in a husky voice. I was planning to say it anyway. It's the potion formula to Sequence 4 of the Sun pathway, unshadowed. The Sun pathway? Derrick instantly looked towards Mr. World, who sat at other end of the long bronze table. His eyes filled with sudden eagerness and longing. However, He maintained his silence because he knew that he was still far from the threshold of a demigod. He had to spend his limited resources to strengthen himself first. Only caring about the near future was the way the City of Silver operated. This was because, to its residents, there might not be any future at any moment. Unshadowed, Audrey nodded gracefully, then happily said, "Thank you for your answer, Mr. World." She felt like she had learned something important again. Unshadowed, Alger muttered slowly before calmly replying, "I'm sorry. I have no need for it." No need for it? Klein was taken aback. This was completely different from the script he had imagined. In his shock, he indirectly caused the world to pause, looking incredulous. It took quite a few seconds before he said, "You can first owe a portion. With Mr. Fool as witness, I believe you'll definitely make up for the rest." "No, I really have no need for it." Alger shook his head. "No need for it. He really has no need for it." He's confident that he would gain the favor of the Church of the Lord of Storms and be bestowed with the corresponding potion directly? Or does he actually have the Sequence 4 potion formula to the Sailor Pathway? The name was Cataclysmic Interrer? Klein quickly thought of two possibilities. What should I do? Don't tell me that I should trade the Witch or Demoness of Pleasure formulas with him. Klein silently mocked himself, deliberately making the world silent for a few seconds before saying, "Other potion formulas, or some secrets I know. Such as, secrets of the peak-level sequences." Alger changed his seating posture a little as he deliberated before answering. "I personally know some secrets of peak-level sequences. How will you guarantee that there's no overlap? How will you guarantee that the secrets you will tell me is equal in value to the Dark Pattern Black Panther Spinal Fluid and Spring of the Elves Marrow Crystals? We'll each give the peak-level sequence secret to Mr. Fool and let him decide if there's any overlap and determine their values. Mr. Fool, is that all right?" Klein manipulated the world and asked himself this question. Then, he said with a supercilious attitude, "Sure." Alger slowly nodded. "I have no problems with that. Let's begin. I really want to know the secret of the peak-level sequences. But I haven't had any extra money lately to buy it." Audrey looked enviously at the world and the Hanged Man as they each conjured a piece of goatskin parchment. Having never worried about money since she was young, she finally experienced the taste of poverty. Very soon, Klein received the content written by the two members. Without a doubt, he first looked at the goatskin parchment from the Hanged Man and discovered that the content was simple. There was only one sentence. "The peak-level sequence conceals the path to divinity." Phew. Great. Otherwise, there would be a need to use other information for the exchange. Klein carefully examined the world's goatskin parchment before chuckling softly. It doesn't overlap. To most Beyonders, the secrets Mr. World is providing is of no value. But in the eyes of others, it's extremely important. This cannot be measured with money. Hearing this conclusion, Alger immediately fell into a dilemma. To him, getting two Beyonder ingredients at the same time wasn't a small burden. He had to sell many valuable items in order to trade for them. To pay such a price to hear a secret that might not be very useful to him? Alger considered it for nearly 20 seconds before saying, "Mr. Fool, can you provide more hints? I can't make a decision yet." Can't make a decision? The corner of Klein's mouth moved slightly. He knew that the words he had said to maintain his image had the opposite effect and had been ineffective. He hesitated for a moment and then smiled. "The content he describes is a detailed supplement to the secret you know." Detailed supplement? A detailed supplement to the path to divinity? Alger didn't hesitate any longer. He turned his head to look at the world and said in a terse and firm voice, "Deal." Then he immediately added, "I'll help you exchange for the spinal fluid of a dark pattern Black Panther and the spring of the Elves Marrow Crystals within the week. Of course, the premise is that they'll appear at the Pirates' Meet. Although the probability is very high, we still have to believe that anything could happen. If that happens, I might have to postpone it to next week, the following week, or even the next month. But don't worry, I will keep my promise." "No problem. With Mr. Fool as witness, there's no need for me to worry," the world answered hoarsely. After they had confirmed the transaction, Klein conjured a goatskin parchment in front of the Hanged Man. Alger lowered his head eagerly, reading through each word voraciously. "There is a sequence 0 above sequence 1. And sequence 0 is the sequence of a true god. They can similarly be reached through the corresponding potions and rituals." Sequence 0? The sequence of the true god. Alger was astonished and shocked at first, But soon he felt relieved, and then he murmured to himself in delight, "I see. I understand what it means." He inhaled silently and leaned back in his chair as if nothing had happened. That secret must be astonishing. Mr. Hanged Man even lost his composure. Audrey looked away with a longing expression and said to the son who was diagonally opposite her, "Mr. Son, I remember you mentioning that the City of Silver has the Dragon Pathway Sequence 9, 8, and 7 potion formulas?" "Yes." Derrick nodded honestly. Sequence 7's potion formula is Psyche Analyst. "If I wish to get it, what is the price I need to pay?" Audrey asked in a reserved manner. "The Sequence 7 potion formula of the Sun Pathway," Derrick replied without any hesitation. Audrey nodded gently and said, "I'll do my best to obtain it." Zio and Furs mentioned before that there's a Beyonder of the Sun Pathway at Mr. A's gathering. He's at least Sequence 7 and is adept at purification and exorcism. Once all the recent events settle down, I can attempt to get it from him. In addition, I should join more of the gatherings at the abandoned education building in that hospital. I should try to come into contact with members of the psychology alchemists. One of the two paths will definitely lead to something. Thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind, but she suddenly realized that she was unable to obtain it even if she discovered clues to the formula. This was because she would be experiencing a financial crisis for the next few months and was barely holding on. The price of a Sequence 7 formula is around £800, so if I scrimp, I should be able to produce that. It's already October. It's almost New Year's. I'll be an adult then, and I'll have the freedom to handle a lot more of my money. Or should I use the knowledge I was taught by Mr. Fool to trade? I wonder what attitude he has towards this kind of behavior. Audrey's thoughts gradually dispersed. She decided to wait until there was hope for the formula before she asked Mr. Fool. The transaction segment came to an end. Klein originally wanted to use the knowledge he knew to exchange for a mystical item without many negative effects, but after sensing how tight the Hanged Man was, he knew that the other party would pay a large price for those two Beyonder ingredients. It was unlikely that he had any extra assets, so he could only give up in regret. As soon as the free exchange segment began, Alger took the initiative to mention, Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos' ship and crew was subdued, giving rise to a new pirate admiral. Chapter 292. Exchanging news. Audrey was interested in the pirate admiral and asked, "What's his name? What was his current title?" "There hasn't been any related news in Backlund." Alger nodded slowly. "She's a lady and was a famous pirate in the past. You should have heard of Ailment Girl Tracy, right?" "No, I don't know much about such things." Audrey shook her head in honesty. "Me too." Sitting at the end of the table, Klein added inwardly. Alger fell silent for 2 seconds, and without wasting any time explaining he said, "In short, she subdued the crew of Kalangos' crew last month. She proved herself with actual action that she had the strength of a pirate admiral. She changed the name of Kalangos' ship to Black Death and calls herself Rear Admiral Ailment. In the past, she acted independently and was someone who specialized in curses, black flames, and ice. Her enemies would always suffer from sudden ailments of various kinds. At present, no one knows which pathway she belongs to, but they're certain that she's at Sequence 5. Audrey listened with relish. She blinked her eyes and requested curiously, "Mr. Hanged Man, can you introduce the 4 pirate kings and the other 6 pirate admirals in detail? I've only heard of their names and titles, but I don't know what Beyonder powers they are equipped with." Alger looked around and saw that both the sun and the world were showing signs of attentiveness. He nodded slightly and said, "That wouldn't be an issue. The strongest pirate king is the king of the 5 seas, Nast. He claims to be a descendant of the 4th epoch Solomon Empire. Not only is he a high-sequence Beyonder, but he possesses the terrifying ghost-shipped Dark Emperor, a relic of the Empire. He's adept at using order. He can pull his enemy into combat, in a domain that he's best at, and create fascinating effects. He's also the oldest pirate in the world. Rumor has it that he's over 100 years old, and he has been active in the 5 seas since the Roselle era. No one knows exactly how old he is. Of course, compared to the other pirate kings, there's a lot of information about him. As for the owner of Dawn, all we know is that she's a beautiful woman. She was once a warlock and is now a demigod. She calls herself Queen Mystery." After introducing the 4 kings, Alger changed the topic to the 6 remaining pirate admirals. The owner of the Black Tulip, Ludwell, was once a subordinate of the King of the 5 Seas. Later, He became independent and calls himself Admiral Hell. Rumor has it that he's established certain connections with the numinous episcopate. He's a powerful medium and can control all sorts of creatures in the spirit world. He's terrifying and odd. Rumor has it that he possesses a ring left behind from the ancient era's death. Admiral of Stars Catlia was once a follower of Queen Mystery, but they've long become estranged. The reason for that, according to rumors, is because she joined a particular secret organization, angering Queen Mystery. And according to the information I know, this secret organization is the Moses Ascetic Order. The Moses Ascetic Order. The Mystery Prior Pathway. The Hidden Sage. Klein suddenly thought of old Neil's loss of control, and the evil god who would whisper temptations into the ears of low-sequence beyonders of the same sequence. This was the first time he learned news regarding the Moses Ascetic Order through reality instead of books. Then, Alger introduced Admiral of Blood Seigneur, who was suspected to be non-human, Rear Admiral Deep Sea Howl Constantine, who possessed a bloodline that was partially from sea monsters, Rear Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards, and Rear Admiral Dusk Bulatov Yoan. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm beginning to yearn for the sea, Audrey said, filled with longing. I don't know when I'll be able to truly travel. No, Miss Justice, it's absolutely not as nice as you imagine. From my point of view, it's an amalgamation of blood, chaos, murder, desire, and horror. Alger calmly doused her enthusiasm. Audrey nodded and switched topics. There have been 11 serial murders in Backlund recently, but one of them has been proven to be a copycat crime. The serial killings are against women who were street girls but are now working normal professions. The murderer cuts open their stomachs and removes all of their internal organs. This sounds like something to do with devil worship. Was it done by someone from the Blood Sanctify sect? Alger instantly made a guess. I don't know. The murderer hasn't been found yet. Audrey yearned to become a detective, bringing Susie along and capturing that cursed murderer. At this moment, Derrick blurted out in a daze. I know about such rituals. He knows. That's right. Before the cataclysm, especially during the Second Epoch, devils were active in the real world where they lived on the ground. They were the object of hatred for both giants and dragons. It's normal for the City of Silver to have relevant records. Their history hasn't been tampered with, nor has there been any blanks over the generations. Klein looked thoughtfully at the son, waiting for him to say more. You know about this? Audrey asked in joy. Derrick nodded. It's mentioned in our devil studies. It's rather ancient. The devils use it as a ritual to supplement their advancement, typically used when advancing from sequence 6 to sequence 5. It's not a ceremony to please the devil, but a ceremony for the devil to assist them in advancing? Audrey asked in surprise. Derrick replied very seriously, that's right. The Abyss Pathway Sequence 6 is called Devil. This is also the origin of that race's name. The Abyss Pathway? Before the Cataclysm, the Devil Pathway was called the Abyss Pathway, and Devil is only the name of Sequence 6. Could Sequence 0 be Abyss? Again, Klein discovered the value of the sun. A lot of knowledge and mysteries were lost across the river of history, but the City of Silver still possessed them. Is that so? Audrey nodded indiscernibly. Mr. Sun, are you aware of the actual details of the ritual? Derrick nodded and said, the minimum requirement is 13 and the highest is 49. The more complete the ritual, the higher the chance of advancement. Between two murders, there must be a minimum of 3 days. Otherwise, it would be easy to lose control, but the interval will also not exceed 9 days. That will cause the ritual to be reset. Every time a murder occurs and after every partial ritual, the devil will eat the victim's organs. From this point on, he'll be in a violent and bloodthirsty state, wishing to harm others until that desire is satisfied once again. That's really scary. Audrey sighed from the bottom of her heart, feeling that she couldn't even bear to imagine it. Klein sat in the thick gray fog, quietly listening and remembering. After discussing the case of the serial killer, Audrey looked at Alger and organized her words. Mr. Hanged Man, there's something that I've been wondering about. I've attended several Beyonder gatherings and find that very few people sell potion formulas. Even if there is one, it would be very difficult for the transaction to close. Why is this? Alger chuckled and said, that's because a potion formula is easy to fake, and Beyonder gatherings are relatively hidden and not too binding. Therefore, no one dares to risk their lives. Are you going to prepare 2 sets of Beyonder ingredients and conduct an experiment with animals first? That price is too high. Audrey suddenly felt a little guilty. Moreover, that's not the only extra cost. Animals can lose control more easily than humans after taking potions. You have to hire a few Beyonders to protect you to prevent you from dying during your experiments. So for most Beyonders, even if a formula appears, they wouldn't dare buy it, Alger added. Audrey felt even guiltier. Alger didn't notice her reaction and continued. Because of this, unless the host or a member of the gathering has the ability to appraise the authenticity of the potion formula and has already won the trust of most members, it's difficult for a formula trade to close. Well, the old Mr. I of Wisdom can. Mr. A is a shepherd, so he should be able to. Klein leaned back in his chair and muttered something to himself in silence. A thought flashed through Audrey's mind as she asked, "Can't it be done by making an oath? Honorable lady, this is an underground gathering. Do you think it's suitable to make an oath in the name of one of the 7 orthodox gods? This isn't something that can be resolved with an oath. A corresponding ritual is needed." Alger chuckled. As for other evil gods or devils and mysterious existences like the hidden sage and the true creator, unless you're their believers, who would dare to swear an oath in their name? Wouldn't they be wishing death upon themselves? At this point he sighed. In addition, without them knowing the acting method, potions easily lead to a loss of control, easily turning people into monsters. Furthermore, the corresponding ingredients are hard to obtain and rather expensive. Therefore, as long as the 7 churches don't allow such trades to be officially recognized, there's no need for them to deliberately control the spread of potion formulas on a wide scale, much less talk about advancement. So that's how it is, Audrey murmured to herself, clearing a huge question in her mind. No wonder. Klein suddenly came to a realization. 7 orthodox gods? Derrick really wanted to ask which 7 they were, but he ultimately held himself back. He thought for a moment and said, "The City of Silver has recently organized an expedition to explore deep into the darkness and found a semi-destroyed temple. The statue that's worshipped inside was a naked man nailed upside down on a cross. There were also a lot of bloodstains on its surface. Do you know which god that is? This is the true creator. The forsaken land of the gods actually has a temple of the true creator. Judging from what the sun said, the true creator shouldn't exist before the cataclysm. Otherwise, it would be impossible for the City of Silver to not recognize it." Klein used his clown ability to control his expression to prevent the shock from showing on his face. Justice, the Hanged Man, and the world exchanged looks, shook their heads, and said in unison, "We don't know." Just as they finished speaking, they heard Mr. Fool in the gray fog say in a deep voice, "That's the fallen creator." Chapter 293. Derrick's Worry the Fallen Creator? Derrick frowned immediately. The residents of the City of Silver had always believed in the omnipotent and omniscient God, the Lord that created everything. Therefore, when he heard a similar name with the word fallen tagged to it, he couldn't help but instinctively reject and feel uncomfortable about the notion. Fallen creator. That's the way Mr. Fool addresses the true creator. So that's the image of this evil god. But why would his statue and temple appear within the City of Silver's exploration confines? That place is suspected to be the forsaken land of the gods. Or perhaps, before it was abandoned by the gods, there was already the faith of the true creator. Could the holy residence that the Aurora Order always talks about be the forsaken land of the gods? Many thoughts came to Alger, but he couldn't make an accurate judgment because the history before the cataclysm had long evolved into myths and legends. It couldn't simply be described as information shrouded in fog. He thought for 2 seconds and deliberately said, "We have another name for the fallen creator. It's the true creator. The faction that believes in him is in control of the Beyonder pathways such as the Secret Suppliant, Listener, and Shadow Ascetic. The subsequent sequence includes the shepherd you mentioned before." Shepherd? The silent Derrick sat up straight, his eyes filled with horror. He wasn't unfamiliar with the Beyonder pathways which the Hanged Man had referred to, other than some of the sequences being described with similar words in the City of Silver. For instance, the Whispered and Listener. So that strange and evil statue represents the Secret Suppliant pathway. Elder Lovia is already a shepherd. She's been acting more and more strangely. Derrick suddenly started to worry about the 6-member council's newly advanced elder and the safety of the City of Silver. In the past, when they explored the surrounding areas, the City of Silver had found a few cities that were completely destroyed. In those places, only a few pieces of rubble had been carved with words that proved the existence of such a civilization. These words were all variations of Dragonese, Jotun, and elvish, and most of them repetitively described one kind of existence. That existence was called Evil God. The residents of the City of Silver who was involved in the expedition were guessing that those cities were destroyed by evil gods. So after finding out that Elder Lovia's pathway was probably controlled by an evil god, how could Derrick not be shocked, worried, and terrified? He returned to his taciturn state, disappointing Audrey, who had been waiting to hear more stories about the City of Silver. After so many gatherings, after her purchase of the dragon race's intelligence, her interest towards the City of Silver had grown even more. His reaction is a little different from what I expected. Alger observed calmly for a while, but he failed to gain anything from it. For a moment, he couldn't find a point of entry into the conversation. And if he asked directly, he suspected that the son would request payment, which wasn't an easy task for him since he was burdened with the debt of 2 Beyonder ingredients. It was at this moment that they simultaneously heard the sound of the table being tapped gently. Klein concealed his fatigue with a thick gray fog and said with a chuckle, "Let's end today's gathering here. Your will is our will." Audrey immediately stood up and curtsied with her illusory skirt. The Hanged Man, the Sun, and the World successively replied with similar words. Klein waved his hand and severed the connection, quietly watching the blurry shadows of Miss Justice and the others disappear into thin air. Then he made his smuff the world disappear. Then he picked up the small badge which he had obtained from Lenivis and studied it. "You can join if you have this item." Klein read the sentence on the back of the badge but realized that it didn't undergo any changes. He thought for a moment and carefully injected spirituality into it. A layer of faint light bloomed and quickly condensed into a light beam, shooting out of the gray fog. However, it was repelled by the endless gray fog. The beam of light suddenly dispersed, transforming into a palm-sized piece of illusory goatskin parchment. On it was written in ancient Faesac, January 4, 1350, 8 p.m. in Bobber Valley. A simple communication device in the field of mysticism? It sends out messages, requests synchronization, and gets the latest rendezvous time and venue? Klein recalled the scene he had just seen and made a preliminary judgment on the use of the badge. 1350, that's next year. The Bobber Valley lies in the area before the Tussock River enters Backlund. The time is precise, but the venue is vague. It's a valley that's almost 100 kilometers long. Perhaps this badge can be used as a location tool when one gets there. Klein turned the badge over and over with interest, trying to figure out the corresponding symbols, incantations, and characteristics, to see if he could copy one himself. Unfortunately, since he was no longer part of the Nighthawks, his knowledge in mysticism was still at the same level as before. He had no opportunities of improving it further. Therefore, after studying it for a few minutes, he could only helplessly give up. As for the phrase, "You can join if you have this item," Klein's plan was to not consider it for the time being. If I can become a faceless by the end of this year, then I can head there in disguise. Otherwise, forget it, Klein silently said to himself. Then he turned his attention to the matter of advancing to magician. The true root and juice of the Mist Trayant is likely in the bag with the sun. If my luck isn't too bad, I should be able to get the spinal fluid of a dark-patterned Black Panther this week. Sequence 7. A mid-sequence. I can already see and touch it. How should a magician act? As he thought about it, Klein began to consider specific issues. Due to his experiences before and after his death and resurrection, he instantly comprehended the true essence of clown. Therefore, in this month or so, he only needed constant acting in his daily life to gradually digest it. He didn't need to make further summaries and adjust it according to the feedback. After killing Lenivis and attaining his initial revenge, the clown potion was completely digested the moment he was laughing amid tears. This wasn't the same as the process in which Klein first digested the seer potion. It was considered a special case, and now he had to return to such a situation with the magician's acting. The true essence of magician, to pass off the illusory with the genuine? According to what Zeradal said in the Emperor's diary, although the main focus of this pathway isn't fate, a portion of it still belongs to it. So, there must be something corresponding to it? For example, it might seem that fate can be changed to a certain extent, but in the end, it turns out to all be an illusion. It's just a magic trick that fools you? Klein rubbed his temples, then wrapped his remnant spirituality around himself and descended into the gray fog. St. George's Burrow, in a 2-bedroom apartment. Fortunately, I prepared another place like this. Otherwise, I wouldn't even know where to hide. Furs stared into the mirror and removed her dropping hair. That's right. Zio replied weakly, lying in bed. I just read in the newspaper that Lenivas is dead, but this matter involves godhood, so it won't end so soon. We have to hide for a while. No, it's you who's going to hide, not me. I'm an upright clinical doctor, the author of a bestseller. Furs looked at herself in the mirror and began putting on simple makeup. Zio couldn't provide a rebuttal as she slowly sat up and said, Thankfully I was sufficiently clever and possess rich experience. When I got someone to make the report, I didn't directly say that it involved the godhood of the true creator. I only described it as seemingly very dangerous and that the target had experienced huge changes like he was praying to evil gods. If not, I wouldn't even dare to stay in Backlund. To be embroiled in high-level battles sure is troublesome and dangerous. I don't want to take on any more of Miss Audrey's missions again. Really? Furs asked without looking back. Zio fell silent for a few seconds and said, Actually, there was no need for us to mention the godhood. Since Miss Audrey was able to discover this on her side, the Church of the Goddess would definitely be capable of doing so. They've most likely killed Giant, right? I can't be sure, Furs replied without mincing her words. Zio froze, then let out a long, slow sigh. Furs stopped what she was doing, turned her head to look at her, and said, This mission was basically completed by you, so I won't be sharing the payment with you. There's a total of £200, so with the £70 you've saved up, even if you deduct the expenses, you should be close to obtaining the first Beyonder ingredient for the sheriff potion. But I wouldn't be able to receive the £100 from the police so quickly. Zio pursed her lips. This wasn't to say that the police wasn't willing to give the bounty money, but that she couldn't take it directly. She had to go through the friend who had helped her deliver the clues. That was the official bounty recipient. Since she believed that this matter would definitely cause a huge ruckus, she didn't have the guts to find her friend anytime soon. As for whether that friend would usurp the bounty, she was quite confident. The other party had helped too many shady bounty hunters before. It was fine to take a commission, but if he dared to directly usurp all of the bounty money, he would have already died in some unknown dark alley. But it will ultimately belong to you. Furs paused for 2 seconds and seriously asked, When you've collected enough money, will you contact the masked guy and work for him so that you can purchase the corresponding ingredients from him? No, unless I can't get it anywhere else and that there's no hope. Zio gave her answer. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall, Audrey was still reminiscing over today's gathering when she suddenly saw her personal maid, Annie, coming over with a piece of paper. Miss, here's your telegram. Annie smiled and said, It's from the east coast of Balam. Alfred's? Audrey happily received it and read it carefully. Dear sister, the rainbow salamander that you asked for has arrived at Pritz Harbor last night. My orders are to deliver it to your manor in the suburbs. Arrived last night? Then it'll be delivered to my manor as early as today and by the latest, tomorrow. Audrey tilted her head to the side and looked at Susie, who was fighting with her snacks. With a shallow smile she said, Susie, the gift I prepared for you is almost here. Woof. Susie looked at her mistress in confusion. Chapter 294. Admiral of Stars Ring. Klein circled the lawn behind Leopard's house a few times on the bicycle the inventor had just completed. It's not bad, it's just as I expected, but there's no need to make a lone standing bell. The cyclist won't be able to free a hand when they encounter a situation. You can combine the bell to the handle. This will make it simpler and more adequate for situational developments. Klein's right hand clasped the brake tight, slowing the bike down to a stop. Meanwhile, he placed the bell in his left hand back to its original spot. Leopard thought for a moment. Yes, that's right. I was simply imitating the ringing bells of the carriages and forgot that this is a brand new mode of transportation. At this point, he looked at Klein, who was getting off the bike with great familiarity, as he placed it on a rack. You give me the feeling that you've ridden a similar type of transportation tool before, and you rode it very well. I'm sure all the other bikes on the market are very flawed and very different from my bike. Sir, do you have time to learn more about bicycle sharing systems? As a clown, I should actually be able to ride a unicycle. Klein silently lampooned before smiling. This has nothing to do with experience. The key is outstanding balance and exercise. He quickly changed the subject. But based on your introduction just now, the production cost is quite high, and it's quite at odds with our product's market segment. You have to come up with a plan as soon as possible to reduce the cost, And you have to understand that nobles, magnates, and other people of the high classes of society will definitely not choose to ride their own bicycles. It would be disgraceful, and the same goes for the middle class with an annual income of £300 or higher. Our target audience are clerks, postmen, so-called working-class aristocrats, and people who earn between £70 to £300 a year. This is just a prototype, yeah, a term invented by Emperor Roselle. It's normal to have a high cost. If the subsequent industrialization is successful, I believe it wouldn't be a problem to lower it to £6. If we can find a cheap replacement material for natural rubber, it'll be even better. That's the most expensive component. Leopard had long considered this problem as he replied. Unfortunately, no crude oil has been found in this world yet. I wonder if it actually exists or not. Can refined coal tar be a replacement in this aspect? I don't know about this at all. I'm neither a student of this profession nor a savant. Klein thought for a moment and said, if the cost can be kept below £4, we'll be rich. As for the cheap material used to replace natural rubber, you can go through Roselle's manuscript. Maybe he has some ideas. Yeah, Leopard said before he suddenly added, speaking of which, I just remembered that there will be an Emperor Roselle memorial exhibition at the Royal Museum next week. It's organized by the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Rumor has it that there will be the original blueprints of Emperor Roselle's inventions and all kinds of relics. The original invention blueprints and all kinds of relics? Klein's heart skipped a beat and pressed. When is it exactly? I'm very interested. From next Tuesday to next Friday, every day from 9 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon. Although Emperor Roselle was once the enemy of the kingdom, the allure of his legendary life hasn't declined because of this. I'll take some time out of my schedule to visit the exhibition. Klein fished out his bulging wallet and took out two £10 and two £5 notes. Here's the second payment. Use it to study how to cut costs and make the most perfect application at the patent office. If you don't have a lawyer you know, I can introduce one, and the last £20 will be given to you next week to find new investors and complete the industrialization of the product. Of course, I'll also help you get in touch with people who are interested. He had never thought of monopolizing the profits of a bicycle. First, he lacked the money for mass production, and second, he believed that he lacked the social connections needed for industrialization, promotion, and sales. He could barely do it himself or hire people to do it. It was hard work with no guarantee of success. It was even possible that he might make a loss. In that case, it would be better to bring in new investors with relevant resources and channels and let the professionals handle the professional work. More importantly, he would then have the opportunity to cash out a certain amount of shares in advance, accumulating the resources and cash that he needed to advance to Faceless. He wanted to avoid running into a situation where he encountered the ingredients but lacked the money to buy them. Besides, I have no intention to be a bicycle tycoon. My identity is sensitive. I should stay away from things that might draw society's attention towards me before I become a Faceless. I'm acting as a magician, not a businessman or a factory owner. Klein sighed in his heart. I know several lawyers, Leopard muttered, and received the second round of investment funds. Why don't you go to the bank and apply for a loan? When we get the patent, I'm sure that a bank will loan us money, like the Backlund Bank or Varvat Bank. We're not just bringing in investors, but resourceful channels, connections, and skills. Do you understand? Klein explained with a smile. He then put on his hat and said, when you've applied for a patent, send me a letter. You know my address. On the Sonia Sea stood an island with an extinct volcano. One by one, ships with masts and sails approached the shore, crowding up the reasonably sizable wharf. The sound of the pirates singing, shouting, laughing, cursing, and cheering filled the air, turning the place into a sea of revelry. The hanged man, Alger Wilson, stepped off the Blue Avenger and climbed a cliff not far away and watched all of this in silence. With the exception of the 4 kings and the 7 pirate admirals, the rest of the pirates only received the news of the event a week ago. Most of them won't be able to arrive in time, as this will prevent the navies of the different countries and the powerful beyonders from the various churches to launch an assault. Alger watched the pirates carrying out buckets of ale without his attention on them. He knew that the Lone Kingdom already had a new generation of ironclad warships, but he wasn't worried about meeting one here. This was because only 4 months had passed, and the advertised invincible fleet still needed more ironclad warships, and different types of ships for support, as well as the time to train military officers, sailors and gunners. There was no way they could create a combat force without a year's time. Even as Alger's thoughts drifted away, the pirates on the ships and wharf suddenly cried out in alarm. Some ran deep into the islands, some hurriedly steered their ships away from the wharf, as if they were running from devils and the plague. In just a few minutes, the bustling scene from before was reduced to a desolate mess and silence. Alger turned his head to look at the sea and saw a ship painted black with a huge white flag with a skull hanging from its mast. The skull was pitch black, and its eye sockets burned with a ghostly blue flame. Black Death, Alger whispered. He understood why the pirates had scurried off. Wherever Rear Admiral Ailment Tracy passed, she would leave a wake of people who got sick for no reason. Black Death approached the shore slowly as a figure wearing a white linen shirt and dark red coat appeared at the ship's bow. The figure was quite a beautiful lady, and she also exuded a heroic vibe. Her beautiful black hair was coiled up high, and she had a white scarf wrapped around her head. She wore beige pants and had a tall and slender figure, and it had no lack of elegance. What attracted the most attention was the woman's long, straight eyebrows and the sharp, bright blue eyes. As she looked around, her eyes would occasionally lose focus, making her look adrift and exceptionally alluring. A wandering poet who had mixed himself with the pirates had arrived at the edge of the cliff at some point. He began reciting. She will always be a girl. She indeed brings ailments. Oh, I'm sick. My mind is full of her. A number of pirates who left gathered once again as they looked at ailment maiden Tracy, mesmerized. Alger held back his feelings of contempt as he glanced at the pirates and scoffed inwardly. Truly a bunch of fellows with no future or will. All they knew was hide moments ago, but now, they've become seduced by her beauty. Although Ailment Maiden is indeed very beautiful, it's not to the extent that it will cause them to act this way. A beyonder power related to allurement? As his mind was whirling, Rear Admiral Ailment Tracy left Black Death and began walking to the Black Palace deep within the island. At that moment, a huge sailboat appeared on the sea. Its flag depicted an eyelash-less eye with 10 stars surrounding it. Admiral of Stars Catlia. Alger nodded gently and muttered silently. Since the Black Death and the other ships were already docked at the wharf, the huge ship didn't approach the shore. Instead, it went around to the sheltered cliff and anchored. Soon after, the gloomy sky suddenly lit up, and bits of stellar radiance sprinkled down, condensing in the air to form a transparent long bridge. It led from the giant sailboat to the palace. A woman stepped onto the long bridge and began strolling through the air. She wore a black, classical robe with numerous symbols and magic characteristics inscribed on it. The most obvious one was a mysterious eye with no eyelashes. Hanging on this woman's waist, there was a celestial globe and a short scepter. She resembled powerful warlocks who were active in the fourth epoch according to folklore. Alger looked up and frowned slightly as he muttered in puzzlement, "That celestial globe looks familiar. It's like, the strange glass bottle I previously obtained, the one I had no idea how to use. It eventually shattered after Mr. Fool pulled me into the gathering." On the outskirts of Empress Borough, Audrey led her maids and the huge golden retriever, Susie, into her own manor. "Miss, the delivery from Enmat Harbor is just ahead," the butler in charge of the manor said in a respectful tone. "All right." Audrey nodded lightly and said half-jokingly to the large golden retriever beside her, "Susie, this is your present." As they spoke, they turned a corner and saw the so-called gift. It was a giant lizard whose skin changed color depending on how the light hit it. It was 3 meters long, and its height reached Audrey's knees even with it laying on the ground. They were 2 colossal creatures, enormous enough to frighten a child. Woof! She turned her head to look at her mistress and saw that her expression was exactly the same as hers. Apparently, she hadn't expected the gift to be so exaggerated. Chapter 295. All ingredients gathered. Audrey had always had a subconscious understanding that a rainbow salamander equals the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland equals the size of one's palm. To her, it would be something soft with grooves, a beyonder ingredient which constantly changed in color. So, what did that have to do with the 3-meter-long colossus in front of her? For a moment she was confused, but when she heard Susie's yelp, she snapped to her senses. She pretended to be satisfied with the result and said to the butler, "This is exactly the animal specimen I need." It's just a little bigger than I thought. Just a little. Take the servants and move them to the warehouse. I'll study it when I'm free." "Yes, miss." Then, the butler immediately instructed the nearby male servants who were furtively looking at their mistress. Audrey looked around and, without another word, led Susie into the manor's study. Using the excuse that she had to focus on writing a return letter to her brother, she made all the maids she had brought stay outside. After the dissection is done, there will be 2 sets of rainbow salamander pituitary glands. A portion can be used to exchange for a Farsman rabbit, just enough to concoct a bottle of the telepathist potion. Audrey gradually recovered from her astonishment and confusion as she began to think about Susie's advancement. At that moment, she thought of a serious problem. She had no idea if Susie had digested the potion or not. If it hasn't been completely digested, consuming the telepathist potion would easily lead to a loss of control. She isn't like a human who can endure through it. Wait, how did she endure it the first time? Besides, her current intelligence is about that of a 10-year-old child's. As she's already learning words in the loan language, and she said she wishes to read newspapers and magazines, as well as books. Audrey fell silent for a few seconds. She glanced at the confused large golden retriever that sat beside her. Susie, have you completely digested the potion? Digest? Susie returned with clear articulation, expressing her puzzlement. Audrey had already told her that what she had taken was a potion, and she had warned her not to tell anyone, and not to tell any intelligent animals that could bark or meow. Audrey nodded her head slowly and heavily. It's a very strange and unique feeling. It feels like something illusory inside your body breaks down and fuses with your mind. You will vaguely see illusory stars one after another, and you will be one of them. These stars will attract each other, in a bid to fuse as one. Susie quietly listened to everything, then replied with a light and brisk voice. Then I should have completely digested it. I've had a similar feeling before. Susie has completely digested the spectator potion? But no one taught her the acting method. At most, I would occasionally remind her to observe more and remain calm. Audrey asked in astonishment, when did you digest it? Last month, the month before last, or perhaps even earlier. Susie tried her best to recall when. Seeing that her mistress's expression was getting odder and odder, she hurriedly wagged her tail and timidly added, I don't remember. I'm just a dog. I won't purposely remember such things. Woof. Just a dog. But you were only a little slower at digesting than me. Don't tell me that when I interact with other Beyonders, I'll say that when it comes to digesting potions, I'm a little better than a dog. Pooey. Audrey, what are you thinking? Audrey maintained her elegant smile and politely praised. Very good. I mean, on this matter regarding the digestion of the potion, you did very well. Returning from Leopard's Place, Klein took a leisurely afternoon nap. But it wasn't long before he was awakened by illusory, disconcerting cries. Mail? Is it Mr. Hanged Man or Little Son? Is one of the final main ingredients for my potion ready? Klein carefully tried distinguishing who for a few seconds and soon forgot about his anger from being awakened. He quickly got up, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog. He noticed that the crimson star that symbolized the Hanged Man was contracting and expanding. Hence, he stretched out his hand, spreading his spirituality before touching it. After the usual honorary names of the fool, the Hanged Man prayed. I've already gathered the dark patterned Black Panther spinal fluid and the spring of the elves' marrow crystals. Please permit me to hold a sacrificial ritual and seek your help in handing it to Mr. World. That's pretty fast. The Hanged Man had said that there would be a grand event among the pirates soon. It seems like it's not soon, but now. He always holds back when speaking, never fully speaking the truth. Klein nodded indiscernibly and said, sure. After a simple sacrificial ritual, Alger resisted his urge to ask Mr. Fool if the celestial globe on Admiral of Stars Catlia had anything to do with him. At this moment, Klein had already forgotten about him and was admiring the 2 Beyonder ingredients on the surface of the long bronze table. The dark patterned Black Panther spinal fluid was a seemingly translucent liquid, but if one looked carefully, they would discover that its clarity was also divided into different levels. The lower one went, the more transparent they were at distinct levels. It fully satisfied someone with an obsessive-compulsive disorder. The spring of the elves' marrow crystals was similar to a faded egg. Its shell was very thin, and it looked like it could easily shatter at a touch. Even without shaking, one could still hear the sound of swishing water inside. I should be able to get 300 pounds and a formula clue. My magician is only short of the true root and juice of the Miss Treyant. I wonder when Little Son will complete the mission. Klein waited in anticipation. As for the other supplementary ingredients, he had already bought them at various stores. For example, The droplet gem he needed to buy was purchased from a jewelry store and he had ground it into powder. 5 grams was about 2.5 pounds. The son, Derrick, didn't keep Klein waiting long, and on Wednesday evening, he whispered a prayer to the fool that he had prepared the true root and juice of the mist treant and asked him to pass them on to the world. The mist treant's true root was heart-shaped, brown, palm-sized, and wrinkled. It looked like an old man's skin, but its back was as smooth and exquisite as a gem. It was slightly expanding and contracting, as though it had a certain amount of vitality. Its juice was light green and sparkling, making it look very delicious. Klein just looked at them, feeling a little smug. In the present day and age, Sequence 7 was the threshold of a mid-sequence beyonder. This meant that a beyonder would finally be able to bid farewell to the state of being only slightly stronger than ordinary people in certain aspects. They would be able to wield a relative abundance of beyonder powers. Phew! Klein slowly exhaled, returned to his bedroom, and summoned himself to bring the beyonder ingredients into the real world. He didn't prepare any additional vessels. He washed an iron pot in the kitchen a few times and began to concoct the potion according to the steps of handling the supplementary ingredients before handling the main ingredients. With the clown's ability at controlling his body, he quickly finished the first stage, and one by one, he put in the dark patterned Black Panther's spinal fluid and the mist treant's true root. Sizzle! With a jarring sound, a pale white fog suddenly rose and was forcefully pulled back into the pot by an invisible force. When everything calmed down, Klein quickly poured every drop of liquid into a transparent bottle that he had prepared. That liquid was rather special. It was as if fireworks were constantly being released from within it. Red, orange, yellow, green, and other colors constantly scattered, disappeared, and then reappeared again. This was the magician potion. Klein stuck a coin worth £1 between his thumb and index finger of his left hand, flicked it up, and opened his palm to catch it. He was using divination to confirm if the potion he concocted had succeeded. Pa! The gold coin fell, its portrait faced up, indicating a positive response. Without any hesitation, Klein put away the gold coin, picked up the potion, and walked out of the kitchen. At that moment, the sky was already dark. The gas lamps in the room hadn't been lit up yet, causing the surroundings to be in complete darkness. Only the light near the oriel window created a gloomy scene. Klein sat down on the sofa and began cogitation to calm his stirring heart and dispel all of his emotions temporarily from his body. After doing all of this, he raised the glass bottle, tipped his head, and drank the magician potion. Gulp! Gulp! The ice-cold potion went down his throat, and at every moment, it felt like countless bubbles were bursting. Klein's entire body was experiencing the stimulation, and massive amounts of information flooded his mind, blooming into fireworks. The veins on his forehead bulged, and his head felt like it was about to burst. However, this wasn't a very difficult situation for Klein to endure. The terrifying ravings before entering the grey fog and the evil roars of the true creator were much more terrifying. Hornasis! Phlegria! Hornasis! Phlegria! Hornasis! Phlegria! The ethereal temptation echoed again. Klein's head expanded and contracted repeatedly before he gradually recovered his thoughts. He began to consciously restrain his thoughts, outline the spherical light, and slowly enter a state of cogitation. After an unknown period of time, his vision recovered. At the same time, he felt an itch all over his body, with his arms feeling the worst. Klein rolled up his sleeves and was surprised to see that one of his arms was deeply wrinkled, like a centenarian. The other arm had lost its color and had become translucent. He could directly see his blood vessels, muscles, and veins. Could it be that I had nearly lost control? No, it shouldn't be. This should be the remnant influences. Klein sat on the sofa in the dark, leaning forward as he watched the anomaly in his arms warily, as if it were a breeding ground for monsters. And all of this had nothing to do with Klein. He sat quietly on the sofa in the darkness, watching his creased skin and the translucent state of his arms slowly recover. 5 to 6 minutes later, Klein silently sighed as everything finally returned to normal. It's a good thing that no one came knocking on the door or ringing on the bell. I only chose to advance after completely digesting the Sequence 8 potion. With such severe effects, it would be hard for those beyonders who depended on time to grind through the potion. It really is difficult to pass this stage. No wonder Captain took 9 years. No wonder Swain, the former captain of a mandated Punisher squad and owner of the evil Dragon Bar, didn't dare to consume the Sequence 7 potion, Seafarer. After sitting silently for more than 10 seconds, Klein slowly stood up. At that moment, he was already a mid-sequence Beyonder. At that moment, he was already a magician. Chapter 296. Magician. He took 2 steps forward and past the coffee table. Klein stretched his body and shook his wrist, but he found nothing unusual. He looked at the gas lamps outside the oriel window which illuminated the darkness and gloominess and said to himself thoughtfully, "My hands are more agile and I'm more nimble. Even if I don't have Beyonder powers, as long as I work hard enough, I can become a top magician." This was his first impression of his own transformation. And just like what was recorded in the Nighthawk records, if a potion provided a specific magical power, then the Beyonder would become aware of it after ingesting it. They would grasp the specific details as though the corresponding knowledge would be injected and imprinted into the mind through a mysterious method. Just now, my head nearly exploded. Klein smiled and shook his head, carefully recalling what he had felt in the corresponding magical spells. It had to be said that Magician was indeed considered a powerful Sequence 7, with it possessing many miraculous abilities that could all be cast very quickly. Among them, there were 3 which Klein valued and liked the most. The most important one was damage transfer. As long as he didn't die instantly, as long as his hands could still move, he could transfer the vital wounds to unimportant areas like his arms, turning fatal wounds into minor injuries. This was a very useful Beyonder ability for life preservation in actual combat. The only problem is that at Sequence 7, wounds can only be transferred around my body, and there's only one opportunity. Perhaps as my sequence is raised, the wounds can be transferred to other items or people. It really does feel like magic. Klein imagined the future. The second spell was Flaming Jump. Within a range of 30 meters, he could phase between a fire spark that he had left behind and the original flame. It was similar to teleportation, which seemed to have a uniqueness of gaining help from the spirit world. Well, it can be used to its fullest when performing magic. Klein mocked himself inwardly with great satisfaction. More importantly, as he digested the potion and raised his sequence, the range of Flaming Jump would increase significantly. The third type of Beyonder spell was the air bullets, which Klein had seen the suited clown from the Secret Order use. The magician could produce air projectiles with power and speed comparable to that of the bullets fired from a custom revolver just by snapping his fingers or mimicking sounds. Furthermore, the effect would improve along with the digestion of the potion and the raising of his sequence. Klein suspected that at Sequence 4 or 5, he could create his own cannonball. This way, I don't need to buy more revolvers and bullets anymore. No, I still need to buy one. There are many matters that don't need me to expose my Beyonder powers. Any problem that can be solved with guns isn't a problem. Klein nodded indiscernibly and began to examine the other spells and spell-like abilities. The fourth type was paper figurine substitutes. At a critical moment, the magician could temporarily change the paper figurine into him while he swapped places. It was a relatively simple substitute spell that could not only block a fatal blow but also weaken the damage from hexes. So this is the use of all the paper figurines that Nimble Right Master Rosago had brought with him. He must feel regret because he was contaminated by the true creator and didn't have the chance to use a substitute at all. The biggest problem with this spell is the need to prepare the materials beforehand, which means that the paper figurines have to be cut in advance. In the early days of the 5th epoch, Beyonders who brought similar items would undoubtedly be regarded as a dark warlock. If it's discovered now, I'll most likely be suspected. Klein mulled over the uses and limitations of paper figurine substitutes. The 5th kind of spell-like ability was called flame controlling. As the name implied, one could manipulate flames within a range of 30 meters with a simple action. It could also be used to ignite certain items within this range. Once the potion has been completely digested, or when I advance in sequence, one could summon a swirling flame out of thin air. The 6th was illusion creation. By influencing the surrounding environment, one could create illusions with colors, sounds, and smells that were close to reality, allowing one to pass off the fake as the truth and deceive the enemy. This is a specialty of a magician. Klein chuckled and walked over to the oriel window as he took in the night scene of the streets with great satisfaction. The 7th was a fake form of underwater breathing. The principle behind it was to create a thin, invisible air pipe which would allow the magician to breathe freely and seemingly turn into so-called murlocs. The problem was that the air pipe had a limited length. At his present stage, Klein could only maintain it at around 5 meters, which meant that if the water depth exceeded 5 meters, he could drown. Of course, the potion's digestion and sequence advancement would result in the growth of the air pipe. The 8th was a spell-like ability, bone softening. This helped a magician break free from handcuffs, ropes, and chests. It's also a specialty, Klein thought in a good mood. The ninth was the evolution of the clown's ability to turn paper into throwing knives, called drawing paper as weapons. Not only could it turn paper into sharp objects, but it could also temporarily turn into weapons such as bats or bricks, etc. These were the 9 main spells or spell-like abilities of a magician. Although they weren't particularly strong in both the offensive and defensive aspect, nor were they particularly bizarre, they stood out for their variety. They allowed Klein's strength to instantly rise by more than 1 level, and his life preservation and means of escape became even better. Moreover, magicians had the ability to cast spells at high speeds. This was a sequence of beyonders who didn't need to chant or inject spirituality. With just a simple action, they could cast a corresponding spell or spell-like ability. In addition, the potion made Klein attain some tiny tricks, but they weren't very practical. I can barely be considered quite a good beyonder. Klein sighed silently. Just as he was about to go out for a stroll and get another revolver and replenish his bullets at the Bravehearts bar, the gas lamps outside the oriel window which tainted the crimson moon's moonlight suddenly turned darker and deeper. Klein looked up in surprise and saw that the dark clouds and mist had dispersed, clearly revealing the red moon, which was a little more than a semicircle. Its outline rapidly turned into a full circle, and in just a few seconds, it had turned into a full moon that was as red as blood. It had only been 2 weeks since the last full moon. According to the normal calendar, according to astronomy, there were still about 10 days left until the next full moon. This is the blood moon? Klein's lips moved slightly as he muttered to himself in relief. In this world, the changes to the room were both regular and irregular. Ordinarily, it was exactly the same experience Klein had in his previous life. However, there were always a few times every year when it would suddenly become round and dark red, just like blood. Such a situation that had no logic to it. At times, it happened only once a year, and sometimes 4 or 5 times a year. Neither astronomers nor mystics could explain this phenomenon or come up with a pattern. Therefore, they could only ignore it for the time being as one of the puzzles. They joked that perhaps the goddess was in a bad mood and that a change in a woman's mood was undoubtedly irregular. Of course, not knowing the reason and not being able to understand the essence of the phenomenon didn't mean that there was no corresponding conclusion. In mysticism, people called this situation the blood moon, believing that it would bring about the rise and eruption of negative emotions, and that it would strengthen the power of the underworld and the spirit world. Even if the dead were summoned, they might still be able to climb out of their graves. This is the 2nd time this year, right? Klein stood by the oriel window, admiring the clear sky, and the disc-like full moon which was red and glistening. He felt he was in a relatively good shape. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough. Furs Wall, who had participated in a gathering that night, was unable to make it back home to the 2-bedroom apartment in St. George Borough. She sat cross-legged on a sofa in the living room, chewing on a new type of bread which had meat and vegetables in it. She had let down her hair as she thought over the plot of her next novel. Suddenly, she frowned and threw away the food and pen in her hand. The moonlight outside the window grew stronger and redder, and the look on Furs's face became more and more painful. Every full moon, she would hear those ravings that would drive her mad. Bam! She fell off the couch, her body writhing as she struggled. After a while, she pulled out a clump of her hair, but the pain did nothing to ease the explosive sensation in her head or to calm the urge to end her life with a knife. Here it comes again. Furs muttered in pain as her legs were stretched taut from the spasms of pain. She chanted the name of the god she believed in with great difficulty, seeking redemption. Great God of steam and machinery. You are essential, the embodiment of. You are an artisan, a protector. You are the glory of technology, glory. As she repeatedly chanted, Furs's suffering didn't abate, and instead it grew more intense. Bam! She tumbled around violently, toppling the coffee table and sweeping the books on it to the ground. Unable to endure it any further, Furs frantically used her nails to scratch the wooden leg of the coffee table, creating one deep scratch after another along with jarring screeching sounds. Pa! Her fingernails broke. Her hair was growing abnormally long. At that moment, she felt that she would lose control that very night and become a monster. She had already chanted the honorable names of several gods, but she had failed to receive any reprieve. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. As she writhed and rolled about, she suddenly saw a piece of paper with the words in ancient Hermes written on it. It was the mysterious incantation Zio had found in the history of the Lone Kingdom's aristocracy. Her chanting of it had even attracted an existence suspected to be an evil spirit. Even if it's an evil spirit. As long as you can help me. I'm willing to accept. Such a thought flashed through Furza's turbid mind. She struggled to look over as she used all her strength to whisper. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Save me, save me. Chapter 297. The full moon's Ravings. Klein had just put on his double-breasted frock coat, picked up his half-top hat, and was walking toward the door when he heard a series of illusory prayers. Who is it? He frowned slightly and listened, but he could only confirm that the supplicant was a woman and that her voice was staccato, as though she were in great pain. Since he had nothing particularly urgent to tend to, the newly advanced magician, Klein, casually tossed his half-top hat onto the coat rack accurately, and he returned to his bedroom. After taking 4 steps counterclockwise, he entered the majestic palace. This time, he didn't see any illusory star expanding or contracting with a deep red glow. Instead, at the end of the ancient mottled bronze table, by the side of the fool's seat was a clear radiance rippling out. It's a prayer from a non-tarot club member. Is it Zio or that lady with curly brown hair? Klein speculated as he took his seat. Since he had already emptied his anonymous account, he didn't suspect that someone was trying to steal his wealth. Leaning back, Klein pointed with his left hand, spreading out his spirituality to touch the rippling light. The scene around him suddenly changed. He saw the overturned coffee table, the slanted sofa, books and papers strewn all over the floor, and a woman with brown hair struggling in pain. At the same time, Klein heard her prayers. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Save me, save me, save me? From the looks of it, she seems to be losing control. Her hair is growing longer at a discernible speed, and her skin is covered with a layer of sinister white light. How could I possibly save her? Klein observed carefully for a few seconds, then mumbled to himself, feeling stumped. It was at this moment that he detected in the woman's anguished pleas a faint, illusory, indistinct raving. Yes, a raving. These ravings were similar to the ones he experienced before rising above the gray fog, but it had no madness or evil to it at all. Furthermore, it didn't contain any obvious malice. It appears that this lady's state of nearly losing control is a result of hearing the ravings. If she stops hearing it, could she be able to calm down and turn for the better? In thought, Klein reached his hand out to the rippling circle of light. Following that, he allowed his spirituality to gush out of his body, establishing a firm and mysterious connection after advancing to magician. His spirituality had become a lot more abundant, and the burden in this aspect had decreased accordingly. Furs felt her head muddling as she felt her thoughts were like boiling water. They were constantly bubbling in a bid to break free of the restraints of her head. Am I dying? I don't want to become a monster. Just as she was woefully thinking this in her mind, the pain flooded over her like a tidal wave. Suddenly, she was wide awake. The pain, the irritation, the madness, and the despair, which she felt so deeply in her bones, seemed to no longer exist, as though it was only an illusion. I managed to endure through it so quickly today? Isn't it longer during a blood moon? Confused, Furs opened her eyes which she had unconsciously closed. She found an endless grayish-white fog beneath her, and in front of her was an ancient mottled bronze table. Where is this place? Surprised, she looked around and saw numerous towering stone pillars, as well as a towering palace that was propped up by those stone pillars. Then, at the very end of the long bronze table, she saw a mysterious figure shrouded in thick gray fog, who seemed to be overlooking everything from above. What is this place? Who is he? Fuzz turned wary and questioned inwardly. Then, she remembered what she had just done. Under her extreme pain, she had chanted the mysterious incantation which Zio had found in the history of the Lone Kingdom's aristocracy. An incantation that was suspected to be directed at some evil god. No, not just evil spirits. He was actually able to temporarily help me get rid of the harmful effects of those terrifying ravings. He even pulled me into this strange world. While Furs suppressed the fear in her heart, she half stood up and bowed. May I know who you are? At that moment, she suddenly recalled the contents of the incantation as she blurted out. You are the fool. Mr. Fool. You are His Excellency, the Fool? Klein smiled, nodded slightly and said, Just call me Mr. Fool. As he spoke, he noticed on the back of the chair in which Furs was sitting on, the symbols and mysterious patterns formed by the shining stars were rapidly changing. In just 1 or 2 seconds, the interior of the room was covered with layers upon layers of doors. Numerous illusory doors of the same kind were formed there. Door. As soon as Klein saw the symbol, he immediately associated it with the mention of Mr. Door in Roselle's diary. During a full moon, the other party would come close to the real world and let out cries for help. Could the Ravings have something to do with Mr. Door? It's the night of the blood moon tonight. An enhanced version of the full moon. This lady corresponds to a door, and the symbol on the back of Miss Zio's seat is similar to the Sword of Judgment. Klein nodded indiscernibly. Through this, he confirmed that once a stable connection was established and that if the other party was a beyonder, the symbol behind the seat would change according to the other party's actual circumstances. They didn't have to necessarily join the tarot club and come to the mysterious space above the gray fog at fixed intervals. At that moment, waves of shock rose up in Furz's heart. The Fool. It's indeed the Fool. That honorable name does point towards a powerful existence. What does he want? Will he want to make a transaction with my soul? It's at least better than losing control from those Ravings. I guess I managed to claw my life back. Whatever happens in the future would just be a bonus. While she was still lost in her thoughts, she suddenly heard Mr. Fool ask with a smile. You hear Ravings from nowhere every full moon? How does he know? Furz looked over in surprise and replied in a daze, yes. Before she finished her sentence, she suddenly thought of a possibility and asked, do you know the origin of those Ravings? Do you know who is trying to harm me? Do you know how to solve this problem once and for all? He's a miserable wretch who is lost in the darkness and trapped in a storm. Klein had intended to reply with the words that would shape his image, but when he thought about it, he couldn't be sure that the woman in front of him had indeed heard the words coming from Mr. Door. In order to not make any mistakes and to not embarrass himself in the future, he skipped over the question and said with a vague smile, he might not necessarily want to hurt you. Perhaps he is just asking for your help. Therefore, the Ravings weren't malicious, not crazy or evil. Asking for my help? But those Ravings push me closer and closer to losing control. If you hadn't helped me, I might have become a monster by now, Furz returned incredulously. Klein grinned and said, that's because you're too weak. I'm too weak? Furz was stunned and at a loss. Klein briefly explained, the difference in your life's natural order and his is too great. Perhaps, just by breathing normally, the storm brought about by him can rip you to pieces. Perhaps, just a glance from him will cause you to die on the spot. Of course, if he purposely controls his own strength, it's not that he can't communicate normally with you. However, his voice might need to pass through layers of obstructions in order to reach your ears. Deliberate control typically implies a failure to call for help. That's if we assume that he's calling for help. The difference in our life's natural order is too great. I would die from just one glance from him. Furz was stunned from what she heard. After quite some time, she forced a smile and said, this reminds me of a saying. You may not look directly at God. Klein smiled at her without giving a positive answer. Could it be that those terrifying Ravings really come from an existence who's nearly a god? Mr. Fool can help me eliminate that person's influence, and all this time, he's been talking about it in a rather bland tone. Does this mean that he and that existence's life's natural order are at the same level? The more she thought about it, the more shocked she became. Even her body couldn't stop trembling. Klein waited a few seconds, then asked, how long does it last every full moon? 3 to 5 minutes. If it's the night of the blood moon, it will exceed 7 minutes. Furz gathered her thoughts and answered honestly. The more Klein listened, the more he felt that the Ravings' owner belonged to Mr. Door. He temporarily put the matter down and smiled. You can return in a few minutes. There is only one way to solve your problem, and that is to raise your life's natural order. Furz hesitated for a moment before saying, whenever I encounter the full moon, can I recite your name? I will be your devout believer. No, there's no need. Klein smiled and shook his head. But I don't mind helping you along the way. Thank you so much. Although she suspected that she was dealing with an evil god, she no longer wanted to experience the same painful nightmare as before. After confirming this matter, she relaxed a lot. Noticing that there were still many seats around the long bronze table, she asked probingly, Mr. Fool, it seems there are others who come here frequently? No, they might not necessarily be human. Furz added silently. Klein smiled and said with a casual attitude, there are few people who are similar to you. I pulled them here for various reasons. They hope that I can hold a gathering at regular intervals to facilitate the trade of formulas, ingredients, information, and missions. I agreed to it. Furs was enticed by what she heard. Thinking that she was already part of this, she boldly asked, "Mr. Fool, can I join this gathering?" "Sure. 3 in the afternoon on Mondays. Remove all disturbances." Klein smiled and pointed at the cards that suddenly appeared on the surface of the long bronze table. They've decided to use the names of the tarot cards as their code names. You can pick one of these, but these already belong to someone and you cannot choose from. Furs nodded her head, shuffling the cards and cutting them with great interest while mumbling, "Let fate arrange my title." Soon, she pulled out a card and looked at it, the Magician. Chapter 298. Together again. Furs's eyelashes fluttered a few times before she slowly opened her eyes, only to find herself lying on the floor of her living room. Through the window, she saw that the bright moon was hanging high in the sky like a crimson disk. The normally thin and blurry chiffon seemed to turn into rich bloody light. "I'm not dead. I didn't lose control. It wasn't a dream just now. I really was saved by a mysterious and powerful Mr. Fool." When Furs sat up and examined herself, she saw that there was nothing unusual about the rest of her body except that her hair had grown longer and denser. "But my life is completely different from before. I don't know if this is good or bad." Silently mumbling to herself, Furs sat on the ground hugging her knees whilst lost in thought. Her mind would sometimes wander off, and at times, she would be anxious, sad, or confused. Above the grey fog, Klein looked at the chair which had the symbol of a layered door on its back. He muttered to himself in thought, "I wonder what kind of information is contained in those ravings. When she's at sequence 7 or sequence 6, she should be able to resist the negative effects and hear the content of the ravings. If she hasn't grasped the acting method, I can let Miss Justice and the others help me teach her. I have sworn under a holy artifact to the goddess that I wouldn't mention anything related to the acting method to people who aren't aware of it. When I advance to sequence 5 and become a nimble right master, perhaps I can use a corresponding ritual and the uniqueness of this mysterious space to remotely control her and directly see what she sees and hear what she hears. That way, I can determine if it's Mr. Door. This gentleman who has witnessed the history of the 4th epoch might be even older than Mr. Azek, who had lived multiple lives. I wonder what sequence his strength and level are equivalent to. 2. Or even 1. After some consideration, he felt that his spirituality was becoming unstable, so he hurriedly descended into the grey fog and returned to the real world. This was a common occurrence after a recent advancement. Therefore, Klein gave up on going out, and he patiently entered cogitation at home, retracting and releasing his spirituality. In the wee hours of the morning, Furs took the earliest steam metro back to St. George Borough before taking a public carriage to the 2-bedroom apartment where she lived with Zio. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Zio, who usually slept late, toasting some bread. "The sudden appearance of last night's blood moon gave me insomnia, so I woke up very early." "Furs, are you all right? Did those strange ravings get stronger?" Zio asked, looking up with concern. Furs's vision suddenly blurred. She turned her head to the side, forced a smile, and said with her usual confrontational tone, "What happened to your brain? Didn't I say it before? The ravings will definitely become stronger during the blood moon. But it doesn't affect me at all." "Yeah, it doesn't affect me at all. Look at me, look at how energetic I am right now. Hey, toast a piece of bread for me too. I thought you didn't like eating it this way?" Zio tidied her short, blonde hair and mumbled softly. After taking his first step at revenge and attaining an advancement, Klein slept through the night. He leisurely went out to buy Fana Potter noodles for breakfast, along with a desi pie and a cup of sweet iced tea. After enjoying the delicacies in satisfaction, he put down his fork and knife and picked up the newspaper. He was in a very relaxed mood as he began to read. A quick scan revealed that the headlines of the Tussock Times read, "Night of the Bloody Moon, the killer demon strikes again." Again. Klein quickly flipped through the front pages of the other newspapers and saw many similar titles. "The 11th True Case. The Police Are Helpless. The cold-blooded killing demon has once again made a clear mockery of the police. The atmosphere of panic is spreading through Backland. The Nighthawks and the mandated punishers must all be having headaches, right?" Klein sighed in his heart. To be honest, he had the urge to catch the killer. Back on Earth, when he was weak, he would often daydream about being a person to uphold justice and punish evil. But now, as a Sequence 7 Beyonder, Klein felt sorry for his past dreams due to his choice of not being a superhero. Sigh, what a pity. This case has already received a high level of attention. If I were to join in, wouldn't that mean that I'm waiting for my identity to be exposed? I still have to be rational. Furthermore, according to the Sun, the culprit is highly likely to be advancing from sequence 6 to sequence 5. Although I won't be afraid of him, I might not be able to catch him even with the new spells and spell-like abilities I gained. It's quite risky. After thinking about it, Klein still chose to follow his deepest beliefs and remain an ordinary citizen. He believed that with the strength of the few churches, if the killer were to continue committing crimes, there was a high chance of them getting caught. After flipping through the news, Klein glanced at the Backland Morning Post and found that the advertisement for the Ernst firm's purchase of goods had appeared again on the 5th page. There's going to be a gathering tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. I can sell the spring of the elves' marrow crystals to the apothecary then, Klein muttered as he memorized the first 4 digits of the price listed. Half an hour later, he finished reading the thick newspaper in front of him and started to seriously consider his future plans. The long-term plan is to advance to a higher sequence, becoming a demigod expert before I plot my revenge against Insanguil. A mid-term plan is to find the acting method for magician. I'll slowly summarize the corresponding mantras to observe, so as to digest the potion bit by bit. During this process, I'll start my search for the characteristic of a human-skinned shadow, hair from a deep-sea naga, thousand-faced hunter's blood, and mutated pituitary gland, as well as the means to remove an evil god's corruption from an object. The Beyonder ingredients of sequence 6 each cost around £1,500. It's very expensive. In addition, I need to obtain a mystical item that's focused on attacking or controlling. Although a magician is very powerful, most of the Beyonder powers are used for life preservation and escaping. In a corresponding environment, the strongest attack is that of a custom revolver. The only boon is how it takes others by surprise, and it also lacks the means to control an enemy. Short-term plan. Short-term plan. I'll be cutting up some paper figurines and make preparations for my powers. I'll visit the circus in the afternoon as a way to relax and for entertainment. I can try to gain inspiration for the acting by observing ordinary magicians. Yes, I saw in the newspapers that there are a few permanent circuses in Backland. After finalizing his thoughts, Klein immediately tidied up his plates, cleaned his knife and fork, and devoted himself into being busy making preparations. When it was almost noon, he put down the scissors and looked at the 3 crude paper figurines in front of him. He sighed and muttered to himself, "This is probably the first time in my life that I've done manual work so seriously. Fortunately, it's just to cut out some paper figurines and not flowers or embroidery. It's fine as long as it's shaped like a person." Sigh, if it wasn't for the fact that my hands have become dexterous, I might have failed today. Klein had just used an additional paper figurine to test his capabilities and confirmed that everything was fine. He folded the paper figurines and hid it in a stack of notes. Klein put them away into his pocket. Just as he was about to go out and enjoy a meal at a slightly better restaurant before heading to the nearest circus to watch the performance, the doorbell suddenly rang, and the pleasant jingling sound echoed in the air. A job? The advertisement I posted should be almost done with its listing period. Wearing a starched shirt and a thin warm sweater, Klein came to the door and grabbed the handle. At the same time, the image of the visitor appeared in his mind. It was a man in his 40s. He was rather fat, and he appeared to have difficulty even standing. His eyes were tiny from the copious amounts of flesh on his face. His skin was rough but very white. He had a gentleman's cane in his hand, and a very tall and large hat on his head. Even though Backland was cold in October, the man's forehead was dripping with sweat. Beside him were 2 attendants in bright red coats, supporting him from both sides. "I don't know him," Klein mumbled, and before his spiritual perception could respond, he opened the door. "Good afternoon. The weather is truly scorching hot." The fat middle-aged man took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat off his forehead. As he spoke, a cold wind blew, causing the 2 attendants beside him to shiver. "Good afternoon. Is there anything I can help you with?" Klein asked politely. "You are Detective Sherlock Moriarty? I have something that I want to entrust you with." The middle-aged man forced a smile and said, "I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rogo Colomon, a jewelry businessman. Please come on in." Klein smiled and made way. Rogo Colomon stepped in with heavy footsteps and sat down on the sofa, causing the old furniture to emit a resistant groan. "What is it exactly?" Klein took out a copper penny and deftly rolled it around his fingertips. Rogo sighed and said, I wish for you to protect my son until tomorrow afternoon. He has offended some lunatics. Until tomorrow afternoon? Have you found a solution? Why not call the police? Klein asked unhurriedly. Rogo remained silent for 2 seconds before saying, Adel got into some bad company and was led to do bad things by them. Oh, it's nothing too serious, but ones that can land him in prison. Unless it's necessary, I don't want to call the police. He recently had a falling out with those bad friends of his. As a result, he suddenly broke down and kept yelling that those people wanted to kill him. I was very worried, so I hired 6 senior bodyguards from a security company to keep watch outside. Then, I hired another 4 private detectives to take shifts watching over Adel, even if he's sleeping. But one of the detectives suddenly had an accident at home and will only be able to return tomorrow afternoon. Therefore, I can only hire another detective at the last minute. I'm sorry, I can only hire you for 1 day. Yes. The reward is £10, and if you were to encounter danger, I'd add more. You'll definitely be satisfied. Is that so? £10 for a day. That's equivalent to a week's salary of Mr. Sammer from next door. Klein was able to tell from the color of the other's emotions that he wasn't lying. During the brief silence in the living room, he kept flipping the copper penny between his fingers and with a thud, it fell into his palm. Klein glanced at it, bent his fingers and smiled. Deal. Chapter 299, Snapping Fingers Westboro, Grim Garden Street. Klein, with quite a stubble around his mouth, wore a pair of gold-rimmed glasses while carrying a top hat and a black cane. He followed Rogo Koloman into a spacious and bright living room. There was a huge crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The walls, corners, and tables were decorated with all kinds of golden carvings and ornaments. The entire area looked gorgeous, exquisite, and luxurious. As expected of a jewelry businessman, a businessman staying in Westboro, Klein scanned the oil paintings by the side and sighed. With every step Rogo took, the fat on his body quivered. It left people maliciously wondering when his clothes and pants would snap. However, as a jewelry businessman, he had enough money to buy clothes of the best quality. Detective Moriarty, this is my son, Adel. Logo stopped at the edge of a carpet and pointed to a boy that was 15 or 16 years old and was sitting on a single sofa. As all the fireplaces in the house were lit, and there were metallic pipes to conduct the heat around, the living room was rather warm. It even made Klein feel like taking off his clothes until he only had a shirt and a pair of trousers left. However, the boy was wrapped in a thick fur coat and had a blanket that looked burning hot on his legs. At that moment, he had his head low, tightly hugging himself as he shivered non-stop. His dark blue hair seemed to have lost its luster. Rogo looked at him with concern and raised his voice slightly. Adel, this is Detective Moriarty. He will be protecting you for today and tomorrow. At these words, Adel raised his head, revealing his pale face, his bluish lips, and his unfocused eyes. Protect me, protect me. They're going to kill me. They want to kill me. His voice became sharper and sharper. In the end, he covered his ears with his hands and screamed. After a few seconds, he gradually calmed down. During this process, Klein had already tapped his molars and secretly activated his spirit vision. Ha! He held back the shock that had crept up to his mouth and carefully examined him again. He saw that the color of Adel's aura had been dyed with a deep blackish-green sheen. This is a sign of being haunted by wraiths, a sign of possible possession. Adel's bad friends are already taking revenge on him. Or perhaps, there were no such things as bad company at all. Klein quietly reached out, held Mr. Azek's copper whistle, and allowed his spirituality to spread. Then, he thoughtfully looked away from Adel and looked at the others inside the living room. By the oriel window stood a man in a black coat. He was tall and sturdy, not smiling, and his waist was bulging as if he were hiding a gun. This should be one of the 6 bodyguards. Klein was about to size up another person when Rogo Koloman introduced Detective Kaslana, her assistant, Lydia, Detective Stewart. At this point, Rogo turned around and pointed at Klein. This is Detective Sherlock Moriarty. Kaslana was in her 30s, had black hair and blue eyes, and thick eyebrows. She was probably a beauty when she was young, but now, because of the sagging muscles on her cheeks, she didn't seem very amiable. Lydia, her assistant, was a red-haired lady of about 20 years of age. Her figure was excellent, but she had an average appearance. Both women wore something similar to what aristocratic riders wore. The white shirts they wore were tight at the waist, which matched the more tight-fitting trousers that facilitated movement. The pleats were the only thing that distinguished their clothes from men. In addition, they provided no concealment for the two revolvers around their waists. This reminded Klein of a saying from lawyer Jurgen that illegal possession of a gun was a sure thing for a private investigator. This was because, unless one was a noble, a member of parliament, or a senior civil servant, it was very difficult to obtain an all-purpose weapon permit. Stuart sat opposite to Kaslana and Lydia. He had a lean face, but he grew a bushy beard. His light green eyes were unusually lively. He was about the same age as Lydia, and almost as tall as Klein, a little over 1.7 and weighing 140 pounds, Stuart had an armpit holster, and in it, there was obviously a specially designed revolver. After exchanging pleasantries, Klein took off his coat, took off his hat, and handed it to the maidservant next to him. Put it somewhere I can retrieve it quickly from. There are some important items inside. In fact, he had already transferred the paper figurines, notes, charms, a matchbox, etc. to his trouser pockets. The only thing left in his coat was herbal powder, extract essence, keys, and his wallet. There were a total of £206 in paper bills in his wallet. Stuart, who was sitting there, turned his head to size Klein up and chuckled. "You didn't bring a gun?" "Gun. This is my gun." Klein smiled and raised his cane. At the same time, he puffed out his cheeks to stimulate a sound. Bang! The sound of a gunshot rang out, and without thinking, Stuart rolled over, while Kaslana and Lydia quickly got off the sofa, each finding a place to hide. Rogo and the servant beside him were both surprised and confused about what was happening. Adel continued keeping his head low as he shivered. When they saw that Klein was only holding onto a black cane and realized that nothing had happened, Kaslana and company calmed down. They frowned and asked, "What just happened?" "Ever since I handed a revolver I picked up to the police, I've been learning how to imitate its sound. It seems to be quite effective," Klein replied half-jokingly. "That's not funny, Detective Moriarty," Kaslana said in a deep voice. "I just wanted to perform some magic for you," Klein lampooned. He handed his cane to the maidservant and solemnly nodded. "I will keep that in mind." Stuart, who was in the most pathetic state a moment ago, didn't seem to be angry at all. He patted his clothes with great interest, got up and asked, "Why haven't I heard of you, Mr. Moriarty? I mean, I know a lot of people in the detective business, but I've not heard about you in the past." "I only came to Backlund in early September," Klein briefly explained. "Is that so?" Stuart laughed and said, "Tonight the two of us will pair up. We'll be in charge of everything from midnight until tomorrow morning. Will that be a problem?" "Nope," Klein responded with the same smile. "Okay, after dinner, you guys have some rest and take over your shifts in the early morning," Kaslana added. Klein took a long look at the trembling Adel and nodded seriously. Nothing happened throughout the afternoon, and the worried male and female hosts prepared a hearty dinner for the detectives and the bodyguards, but no alcoholic beverages were provided. After eating and drinking to his heart's content, Klein and Stuart, a young man with a full beard, went to their rooms on the second floor. Seeing that no one was around, Stuart shook his head and said, "Sherlock, you should have noticed that the problem with Adel isn't something regarding revenge." "Bro, you sure are affable." Klein's expression didn't change as he asked, "Why do you say that?" "He looks more like he has a mental problem, or according to the countryside, he's been haunted by ghosts and evil spirits. Frankly, I'm afraid of that." Stuart sighed. "Mr. Colomon should take him to a psychiatrist, and if that doesn't work, get the priests from the Lord of Storms to sprinkle some holy water and perform a ritual." "You can suggest it to him," Klein said objectively. "If Adel doesn't get better, I'll consider it in about a couple of days." Stuart glanced sideways at Klein. Klein laughed and replied, "That's up to you. My mission will be over tomorrow." At that moment, the two of them had arrived at their destination and entered their respective rooms. 1 in the morning. Inside Adel's bedroom. Klein sat in a rocking chair, holding on to Azek's copper whistle, quietly watching his ward. Stuart sipped his coffee at his desk. The two of them didn't speak, afraid that they would wake the sleeping Adel. As time passed, a cold chill swept through the room. Adel sat up and opened his eyes. "What's wrong?" Stuart asked somewhat nervously. "To the washroom," Adel replied in a soft, dreamy voice. His face seemed paler, and his lips were turning purple. Stuart was about to speak when he saw Sherlock Moriarty stand up and nod at him. "I'll follow him." "All right." Stuart let out a sigh of relief. Putting his hands into his pockets, Klein stayed one step behind Adel and followed him to the entrance of the washroom 2 rooms away. Just as Adel was about to close the door behind him, he saw a figure flash in. "I can't let you out of my sight." "Heh, do whatever you have to do, and pretend that I don't exist." Klein smiled and leaned against the wall. Adel remained silent, his eyes unfocused as he looked into the mirror. He turned on the faucet and let the water flow. At this moment, Klein took out a box of matches and lit a matchstick, as though he wanted to smoke. However, he didn't do so. He blew on the air and allowed the match to go out. "Pah!" Klein casually threw the match in front of him and took out another item. Adel, whose back was facing him, suddenly straightened up. The figure in the mirror was so pale that it looked like a corpse. Whoosh! In the washroom, a cold wind howled. While keeping his lower body fixed, Adel turned around and glared at Klein's left hand, at the delicate copper whistle that was being tossed up and down. Whoosh! A gust of cold wind blew across Klein's face. He continued smiling and snapped his fingers. With a loud bang, a flame rose from the ground, igniting an invisible figure. The figure struggled for a few moments before completely dispersing. The flames extinguished as a result. Klein put away Azek's copper whistle and looked calmly at Adel, whose eyes were beginning to focus. Adel appeared to have finally awoken from a long nightmare. He saw a young man standing a few steps away. The man was wearing a white shirt, dark trousers, and a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He was leaning against the wall with a smile on his face. Then, he heard a gentle voice. "What happened to you?" Chapter 300. Spirit Dance. What exactly happened? Adel muttered this question softly and realized that he couldn't remember what he had done the past few days. He looked around dreamily, frightened, panicked, and confused. "Who are you? Where is this place? This is your washroom. Don't you recognize it? I'm a private detective in charge of protecting you." Klein looked at the teenage boy who hadn't figured out the situation around him and chuckled in response. "My house. Detective to protect me. What exactly happened?" Adel looked around in astonishment and murmured to himself. Suddenly he stopped. His already pale face filled with unconcealable fear. "And maybe there really are ghosts in this world. There really are ghosts." His voice was shaky, but Klein could hear 2 completely different feelings from his voice. Fear and excitement, and these were perfectly depicted by the color of his emotions. Excited? Did this boy end up provoking a wraith because of his thirst for excitement? It's true that the young are bold and unafraid of death. Klein made a preliminary guess, but he asked in confusion, "Ghosts?" After becoming a magician, his spirit vision had been slightly enhanced, but not by much. He was still unable to see the astral projection surface deep in the ether body and, as such, unable to judge whether the target was a beyonder or not. Adel's pale face suddenly flushed red. "Yes, ghosts." He flailed his arms and added, "There exists a wider world beyond our senses. I'm serious. Death is not the end of everything." This line. He's indeed an adolescent. However, I think I've seen similar words somewhere. Klein smiled and said, "I believe in another saying. In the face of time that is even more ancient than ancientness, even death itself will disappear." Without waiting for Adel to say anything, he took out his gold pocket watch, opened it and said, "So, how did you get yourself into the state you were in before? You were like a patient with a nervous breakdown." Adel turned his head and thought for a few seconds, then he said, "I joined a society. It's not an ordinary society. We all believe that death is not the end. We can use mysticism to even sense death directly and understand that everything can be reversed. Yes, we believe that the dead can be resurrected." Klein, who had just climbed out of his grave more than a month ago, chuckled dryly. "You and the others were trying to revive the dead? Death is not the end. A world beyond the senses. Everything can be reversed. Mystic sensing. Aren't these the teachings of the numinous episcopate? These were all created to revive death." He muttered to himself silently in enlightenment. "Yes." Adel nodded, his eyes bright, but completely unable to hide his fear. "Where did you get your corpses?" Klein pressed. "We will secretly dig up graves, those that haven't been buried for long, or buy them from the hospital," Adel said as he recalled. It's indeed a crime that can get you thrown into jail. It's no wonder that Rogo Colamon doesn't want the police involved. You sure are bold to get your thrills. Klein maintained his genial smile and asked, "And did you succeed?" "Not yet. The way they looked at me during the last gathering was like they were looking at a corpse, as if they were wondering where to place their corresponding mystics. And then we danced a spirit dance and communicated with the world beyond with our senses, and then, I lost all my memories since then." Adel's body began to tremble uncontrollably. Spirit dance? It really is the numinous episcopate. This fellow became a test subject for his companions? Klein frowned and asked, "Your memory is disconnected from that point until now?" According to the internal records of the Nighthawks, spirit dances originated from the ancient sacrificial dances that were popular in the southern continent. It was the ritual method that death loved. A spirit dance was to use the beat, rhythm, and movements to harmonize one's spirituality so that it could interact with the natural environment so as to establish an interaction with the target of the prayer. Then, combined with a simple altar arrangement and corresponding honorific name, it can achieve the effects of a more complex ritualistic magic. "Yes," Adel softly replied before he suddenly raised his head. "What day is it today? What time is it now?" "Friday morning, 1:12 a.m., Klein answered based on his memory. Adel subconsciously took a deep breath and said, "I've missed the newest gathering. They conduct a resurrection ritual outside Grimm Cemetery every Friday at 3 in the morning. Grimm Cemetery got its name because it wasn't far from Grimm Garden Street." "You still wish to go? Have you forgotten what had happened to you?" "Oh, you don't actually remember, but you should ask your father, your mother, and servants," Klein reminded the young man in front of him. "And I might not be able to help you any further," he added silently in his heart. After this incident, he discovered another weakness of a magician, which was the lack of an ability to deal with wraiths and shadow-related creatures. Only the control of fire barely counted. But after those creatures possessed a human body, exorcism and purification became a problem. Unless he wanted to kill both the ghost and the human. Of course, Klein wasn't completely helpless in this aspect. He could conduct ritualistic magic to do similar things, but that would be very troublesome. It would easily expose his identity and was unsuited for actual combat. After some thought, he had finally chosen to use Azek's copper whistle to lure the wraith out. Then, he controlled the flames to complete the purification. However, the level of damage wasn't high. If he were to encounter a slightly more powerful wraith, it was possible that he was unable to take care of it. "I still lack items or charms that deal with undead creatures. If only I had the sealed artifact 3-0782, Mutated Sun Sacred Emblem." Klein's thoughts were momentarily distracted. Adel suddenly remembered his missing memories, and his face turned pale again. He answered with a trembling voice, "No, I don't want to go. I never want to go again." "Very good." Klein smiled in support. Adel looked at his face, which didn't contain the slightest bit of fear, and subconsciously asked, "Aren't you afraid after I've said so much?" Klein stopped leaning against the wall and slowly straightened his body. He replied in a relaxed tone, "For a detective, they would rather not believe something unless there's concrete evidence." He opened the door and walked out, wondering if he should make contact with the numinous episcopate. After all, this might involve the mystery of Mr. Azek's life. Adel looked at the private detectives back in a daze. It took him quite some time to realize that there was no one in the washroom other than himself. Furthermore, the moonlight outside was so gloomy that it left long shadows, making it seem as though something invisible was lurking and watching. He shivered and hurriedly shouted, "Wait for me." As he spoke, Adel quickened his pace, rushed out of the washroom, and followed closely behind Klein. "He knows fear and is apprehensive. That means he's still redeemable," Klein mumbled before inserting his hands into his pockets. When he returned to his bedroom, Stuart didn't notice that Adel had already turned for the better. He still wore a serious expression from the ghost story he imagined himself, so he didn't dare to walk around recklessly. After Adel fell asleep again, Klein took out a copper penny and let it move between his fingers. When it was close to 2:50 a.m., he threw up the coin and caught it firmly before standing up and whispered to Stuart, "I'll be heading to the balcony to smoke a cigarette." "Be quick," Stuart urged with somewhat taut nerves. Klein put on his long gown and walked slowly out the door to the balcony at the end of the corridor. Then he hid in the shadows. Then, he pulled out a rather crudely cut paper figurine. "Pa!" Klein violently shook his wrist, causing the paper to make a crisp sound. The paper quickly expanded and turned into a human. The person was about the same height as Klein, a wax statue intrinsically carved with the same exact facial features. This was one of the uses of paper figurine substitutes. Soon, Klein focused his mind, clenched his right fist, and lightly tapped his body. Without a sound, the figurine seemed to come alive. It even had a cigarette with a glowing red head in its mouth as the fragrance of tobacco wafted out. By delegating this figurine, this illusion can last half an hour. I'm really a magician. Klein put on his gloves, reached out, and pushed himself over before sliding down the balcony stealthily, avoiding the patrolling security. Outside Grimm Cemetery, in a secluded forest, Klein stood among the treetops as he looked at the relatively open and flat area not too far away. Around him were evergreen leaves and brown branches, but their surfaces were stained with gray dust. From what Klein could see, there were about 8 young men and women wearing long black robes dancing and twitching around a corpse. The dance was full of rhythm, as though it had some sort of mysterious flavor to it. The girl shook her long hair and the boy extended his hand while kneeling. This scene had a subtle connection to their surroundings. It was the rhythm of nature. After they danced for 3 to 4 minutes, everything within a 10-meter radius was affected by a wild and confusing atmosphere. The atmosphere gradually turned sinister, and there was a hint of divinity mixed in it. It really is a spirit dance. Ritualistic magic that even normal people can participate in. Klein cast his gaze away and looked at the man in black robes who was chanting an incantation beside the corpse. Earlier, he was the one who was instructing those young boys and girls on how to perform the spirit dance. He should be a member of the numinous episcopate, with a high probability of being a beyonder. Klein nodded indiscernibly, intending to watch the resurrection ritual. At this point, the dance reached its climax. The adult man in black lifted his head and took off his wig, revealing the strange tattoos engraved on his bald head. He raised his hands and shouted, "Death, honorable death, is about to return." After he finished shouting, the dancing stopped. The 7 to 8 youths stood on either side. They appeared to be in a daze, filled with anticipation, excitement, and fear. Next, the man bent down and opened the iron cage at his feet, taking out a black object. Klein looked over and saw that it was a blue-eyed black cat. Did this works too? He was obviously stunned for a moment. Suddenly, he thought of the various folklore related to a black cat. For example, if a black cat which symbolized the evil emissary of hell jumped over a corpse, the corpse would be awakened. This was the first time Klein was seeing someone use a similar method in a ritual. The man stepped forward while restraining the black cat from struggling before throwing it at the corpse. Meow. All the black cat's hairs stood on end as it hissed and leaped over the corpse. At that moment, Klein felt like he could understand cat language. He believed that the cat must have said one word, fuck. Chapter 301. Awakening Meow. The black cat's cry echoed in the open area that was surrounded by the secluded forest. Regardless of whether it was the adult black-robed man or the 15 or 16-year-old boys and girls, all of them simultaneously cast their gaze onto the corpse lying in the middle. A gust of cold wind blew, and the black cat landed on the ground, staring at the human who had just thrown it. It kept flicking its tail around. All of a sudden, its fur stood on end again. Then, exerting great force with its hind limbs, it jumped up and fled in another direction. Unfortunately, whatever it did had failed to attract any attention. All the humans present had their attention focused on the motionless corpse. Seconds turned to minutes, but the corpse didn't undergo any anticipated changes. Another failure? One of the teenagers moved closer and crouched down, poking at the dead man's skin with his fingers. There's no reaction. He turned around halfway and spoke to the man in black and his companions. At this moment, he felt a gust of wind hit his face from beneath him. With a swoosh, the corpse sat up. The youth was startled and immediately cheered in surprise. It's a success. It's a success. Before he could finish his sentence, the corpse grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him into its arms. Then, it opened its mouth and bit down, producing a sound and causing blood to splatter. Ah! Help! The youth screamed in horror and retreated with all his might, but he couldn't break free. The corpse raised its head, revealing rows of white teeth, as well as bits of flesh hanging between its teeth, and blood flowing from its mouth. The black-robed man was stunned for a moment. Then he took out a whistle that was brass in color. He put it in his mouth and blew on it. Then, he said in Hermes, "I command you in the name of death." As his voice echoed in the air, The corpse stopped chewing and momentarily froze on the spot. The youth, whose neck and shoulders had been mangled by the bite, similarly collapsed as if he had lost his soul. The dirt around his nether regions was completely moist. "It really is possible," the black-robed man muttered in pleasant surprise. He pointed at the corpse and once again said in Hermes, "Get up." The corpse abruptly stood up. Then it threw back its shoulders before quickly running into the depths of the secluded forest. "Come back," the black-robed man cried out in surprise, but the corpse showed no signs of stopping. He blew his whistle again and shouted with dignity, "I command you to return in the name of death." With those words, the corpse disappeared into the woods. "I ordered you to return." The black-robed man stood rooted to the spot in stupefaction as he mumbled to himself in a daze. In the woods, Klein held Isaac's copper whistle and the matchbox in one hand. He kept lighting matchsticks and shook his wrist to extinguish them before throwing them to the ground. During this process, he moved backwards in an arc tap. Tap, tap. A corpse with a pale face and a foul stench rushed over. Its lifeless eyes stared straight at the ancient and exquisite copper whistle. As Klein retreated, his cheeks puffed out, he aimed at the corpse and simulated the sound. Bang! The corpse suddenly staggered as a penetrating wound appeared in its chest. Bang! Klein puffed out his cheeks again and fired another air bullet. Splat! The head of the corpse shattered as rotten liquid dripped from it incessantly. However, that wasn't a fatal injury to the corpse. It only slowed down for a moment before it continued again. Upon seeing this, Klein took a step back and snapped loudly. Pa! A bright flame rose from the ground, enveloping the corpse and igniting its outer garments. Tap, tap, tap. The corpse rushed through the flames and continued to charge forward like a mad bull. Pa, pa, pa. Klein kept snapping his fingers, causing red flames to appear on the ground, one after another. The corpse didn't feel any pain as it passed through the flames, but gradually, its body began to burn, and the flames grew more and more intense. It gave off the strange feeling as though a candle was melting. Finally, the corpse, which had turned into a torch, arrived in front of Klein as it clawed at him. At the same time, a flame rose up and engulfed both him and Klein. The corpse grabbed Klein's shoulder but only produced sparks. Klein's figure dissipated in the red light and reappeared in the farthest burning pile. At that point, the corpse seemed to have exhausted all of its strength and stopped struggling. It quickly melted under the dark green flames, turning into ashes and oil wax. "He's stronger than all the zombies and wraiths that I've met before. Well, not as good as Mr. Isaac's descendant. If it weren't for me, they would all be dead here today." Klein shook his head and walked through the trees toward the open area. At this moment, the black-robed man had already noticed the changes in the forest. Without any hesitation, he turned around and ran, while the 7 to 8 youngsters scattered in a flash. However, when they realized that they were the only ones in the area, they timidly stopped and returned to the original area where they gathered together. Having just experienced the awakening of a corpse, and how the corpse had bitten one of the youths, they didn't dare to run away, alone, in the deep, dark night. It would make the back of their necks feel cold. They looked at each other. No one dared to help the youth who was badly mutilated in the neck and shoulders, afraid that he might turn into a zombie at any moment. In the short silence that made their hearts beat like a drum, they saw a clown, wearing flashy clothes with red, yellow, and white paint covering his face, walking out from the forest. This was an illusion that was personally created by Klein. He surveyed his surroundings but didn't pursue the black-robed man. Instead, he asked in a hoarse voice, "Who was the one who presided over the ceremony?" "Who?" It seemed as if the teenagers were still in a daze. It took them a few seconds before they pushed out a trembling boy who replied, He's our language teacher in ancient Fasak, Kapuski Reed. He claimed to have a deep understanding of death and wanted to lead us in the search of the mysteries of immortality. So he's a teacher from school." The mysteries of immortality? You really don't need to pay taxes to brag. Judging from his performance just now, this fellow shouldn't be a spirit medium. At the very most, he would be a gravedigger. In fact, he might only be at sequence 9, a corpse collector. Of course, he might not be from the death pathway and simply joined the numinous episcopate because of his adoration. After Klein got the exact location where Kapuski stayed, he thought for a moment and said, "You guys can go back now. Don't get involved in this anymore. Don't leak this out. Otherwise, all of you will die." Then he emphasized again, "All of you will die." The young boys and girls who had been scared witless by what had just happened all frantically nodded. They prepare to leave with each other's help. At this moment, a young girl with smooth hair pointed at her companion who was moaning in pain on the ground and asked, Will he be all right? He won't die for now, but you have to take him to a doctor. Say that he was bitten by a hyena that often eats rotting meat. Klein ignored them and headed back into the woods. The young man and woman looked at each other, and someone blurted out, Excuse me, may I ask how we should address you? Klein smiled and deliberately misled him as he replied in a low voice, I'm just a gatekeeper of hell. As he spoke, a mist spread out, and his figure disappeared from where he stood. Of course, those were all illusions. A gatekeeper of hell? The young men and women repeated the word softly, each having their own thoughts. However, after a gust of bone-piercing cold wind blew past, they trembled once more, supported their companions, and left the place without daring to look back. This is a member of the numinous episcopate? What a disappointment. If he didn't abandon his current identity, I would pay him a visit in the middle of the night to see if he knows anything. Yeah, I have to teach him a lesson so that he wouldn't dare to bring trouble to the students again. Does he think spirit dances and resurrection rituals are child's play? Klein habitually judged the situation from a Nighthawk standpoint. Soon, he returned to Rogo Koloman's mansion and waited patiently for the bodyguards to pass by during their patrols. As soon as he found an opportunity, he climbed over the fence and quickly followed the shadows to the house. Then he quietly climbed up to the balcony. At that moment, the figurine disguised as him was still smoking. Pah! Klein snapped his fingers. The figure in front of him turned into a thin piece of paper and floated onto his palm. Compared to before, this piece of paper was covered with red, rusty marks and was no longer usable. Klein didn't dare to throw it anywhere. He folded it and placed it in his pocket. Having done all this, he sauntered back down the hall and into Adel's bedroom. What took you so long? Stuart asked in a trembling voice. He had gone to the door to inquire, and he had found Sherlock Moriarty smoking one cigarette after another. Due to his duty, he didn't dare leave the bedroom. Klein laughed and replied, Take a rest and relax. You can go too, I don't mind. Just as Stuart was about to agree, he suddenly thought of something. He would end up being the only person on the balcony, surrounded by the dark night and without sufficient brightness. There would be a cold wind and an environment that always reminded one of a ghost story. Therefore he forced a smile and said, It's fine, I don't need it. Klein smiled silently and sat down again, letting the reclining chair rock gently and slowly in the night. This continued till daybreak. Nothing else happened. When Adel woke up, he sat up in bed, lost in thought. Klein didn't say anything, but he swapped places with Kaslana and her assistant and slowly walked to the guest room to catch up on his sleep. He was asleep when he heard Rogo Koloman exclaim in pleasant surprise. Oh my boy, you're fine now? Holy Lord of Storms, I'll donate 300 pounds to the church. Why you are telling me that they won't kill you? It was all a misunderstanding? 300 pounds? How extravagant. Klein rolled over and wrapped his arms around the soft warm quilt while mumbling. Then, he went back to sleep. At noon, when Klein went downstairs to have a meal, Kaslana sat across from him and asked with a slight frown, What happened last night? Nothing, Klein answered simply, and then he laughed. Does Adel waking up and going to the washroom count? Next to him, Stuart slowed down his actions and nodded in agreement. She glanced at their faces, then she retracted her gaze and replied in a low voice, No. The corner of Klein's mouth curled up as he skillfully cut his steak. Chapter 302. A clue. The detective, who had been on leave, returned to Grim Garden Street shortly after Klein and the others had finished their lunch. This also meant that his assignment was over. Due to the visible improvement in Adel's situation, Rogo Koloman was quite generous in the settlement of his pay, and he paid an additional 50% above the £10 which they had agreed upon. As expected of a jewelry businessman to be this generous. However, compared to the other people in Westborough and Empress Borough, he isn't considered that rich. Grim Garden Street is close to the suburbs, and it's not too far from the cemetery. I can reach it in 10 minutes if I run at full speed. Miss Bodyguard, no, Miss Sharon, is highly likely of being a Sequence 5 Beyonder. She charges £1,000 for 3 days, while I, as a Sequence 7 Beyonder, am only worth £15 a day. There's still a big difference. Of course, if I were to take on such missions every day, my income would be over £5,400 a year, putting me at the top of the middle class. Even the top manager of the Backland Bank makes £5,000 a year. Heh, this is just pure fantasy. For most detectives, business comes sporadically. And the amount of Beyonder ingredients I need to advance to Sequence 6 is definitely more than £3,000. Just thinking about it makes my head hurt. For normal people, this is a huge sum of money, enough to sustain a good life. The good news is that even if I grasp the acting method, digesting the Sequence 7 potion will take me somewhere between 6 months to 3 years. Even if I can quickly conclude the rules of a magician, I'll only be able to push forward that lowest threshold by 1 to 2 months. I still have plenty of time to save up and search for clues to these ingredients. Wait. Miss Justice still owes me, my adorer £5,000. However, her financial situation isn't in good shape recently. It will be difficult for her to come up with a large sum of cash in the next few months. Klein took the 3 £5 notes and left Westboro with thoughts running through his mind. After returning to Minsk Street, he quickly burned the used paper figurine and made another 2 more. In the evening, he took the steam metro to the Backland Bridge district, and according to the numbers provided in the newspapers, he knocked on the door of the house where the gathering would take place. Similar to the past few times, he put on an iron mask that covered only the upper half of his face, wore a hooded black robe, and followed the attendant into the activity room, where only one candle burned quietly. At first glance, Klein noticed that the number of Beyonders present at this gathering was less than half of what it used to be. I came at the exact time. Are the others late? This time, Klein didn't change his gait and picked a corner before sitting down slowly. After a few minutes, the old eye of wisdom cleared his throat and said, "Let's begin the gathering. The others shouldn't be coming." After saying that, he gave a brief explanation. As the serial killer has yet to be found, the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, and the machinery hive mind, as well as a large number of MI9 Beyonders, are out doing large-scale investigations and searches. Under such a situation, it's very normal and understandable for those friends to be unwilling to go out and participate in gatherings. Frankly, I'm surprised by the number of people that showed up today. Sure enough, a circle of Beyonders isn't isolated. They would also be affected by current affairs. Klein looked around and saw that the fat apothecary wasn't absent. His heart immediately relaxed. The apothecary nudged the metal mask on his face, calling out without much hope, seeking to purchase the spring of Elves Marrow crystals. Price is negotiable. I have it, Klein said without hesitation. He was worried that someone else might have found this Beyonder ingredient, thereby causing the price of his stock of goods to fall. Although Beyonder ingredients were rare, and it was rare for items to reappear in independent circles, one could never be too careful. Seeking to purchase the spring of Elves Marrow crystals. The apothecary didn't seem to hear the response. He was halfway through the sentence when it suddenly struck him. He turned his head to look at Klein and blurted, "You do?" "Yes." Klein found his fiery gaze a little too overwhelming. As he did so, he rolled up his black robe and took out an iron cigarette case. "Pah!" Klein opened the cigarette case, revealing the faded, egg-shaped spring of Elves Marrow crystal. "If you're worried, you can let the old Mr. Eye of Wisdom appraise it," Klein added in a low voice. This wasn't really necessary because it was obvious if something was a Beyonder ingredient or not. It was also quickly identified if something was contaminated or not. However, if one was lacking in mysticism knowledge, a Beyonder ingredient could very easily be mixed up with similar-looking ingredients. When that happened, one needed an appraisal. The apothecary looked like he was looking at a beautiful lady he had been yearning for all this time. He looked at the Beyonder ingredient in Klein's hands, mesmerized. After a few seconds, he shook his head and said, "No, there's no need. That's it. That's it." Klein curved the corner of his lips into a smile and named his price. £300 and clues to the apothecary formula. Clues to the apothecary formula. "It's you." The apothecary was stunned for a moment before he finally understood who the man was. It was the guy who made him bring the sedative for nothing. Soon after, his heart pained, his regret similarly reaching its limit as he sighed emotionally. "You really are a lucky guy. Why didn't I choose that road of fortune? I'm the king of yellow and black who wields good luck after all." Klein lampooned himself. The apothecary sighed and changed his posture. "That's too expensive. £200 and a clue to the formula." "The clue to the formula is only a bonus because I cannot confirm its veracity. Therefore, £300, not a penny less. I believe it's needed elsewhere." Klein smiled. "This price is actually very fair. If it were anyone else, they might have offered 400 or even 500 pounds, and you might have even accepted that price. I'm not that foolish. I can still wait, the apothecary grumbled before saying, the clue can be verified by old Mr. Eye of Wisdom. It must be something that exists objectively, something that has detailed information before I'm able to appraise it. Just a clue isn't among these conditions, Eye of Wisdom said. Divination, on the other hand, can roughly determine whether the clue is effective as long as it doesn't involve powers 2 or 3 sequences above myself. Klein silently said to himself. However, he wouldn't reveal his expertise in divination at a Beyonder gathering. All right then. 300 pounds plus the clue. You lucked out. The apothecary took a deep breath and pulled out a thick wad of cash. He then counted the corresponding amount and then asked the attendant to bring him a pen and paper before he started writing. After he was done writing the clue, he crumpled the paper into a ball and handed it along with the cash and some items to the attendant. Klein was suddenly stunned when he saw the attendant walk over. In addition to the cash and clue, there were also 4 glass tubes filled with what seemed to be pure liquids. What are these? Klein asked, perplexed. Have you forgotten? Your sedative, the sedative I specially concocted. It's 10 soldi a bottle, £2 for 4, so the cash there is £298, answered the apothecary. If you're worried about my sedative, you can have it appraised. I really forgot. I did all of that to gain Miss Sharon's trust, and now that she's not here, well, it's fine. Maybe a sedative would be able to handle some unexpected situations. Klein stopped talking, took out the spring of Elf's Marrow crystal, took the items, counted the cash in front of everyone, and determined their authenticity with the faint candlelight. A total of £298. That's right. Seeing that his wallet could no longer hold any more cash, Klein could only roll up the bills and slip them into his pocket. After putting away the sedative, he unfolded the note and glanced at the clue. On the south side of the bridge, on Rose Street, at the Harvest Church, find Bishop Utravsky. As long as you help him complete a mission, you'll be able to get the apothecary formula. Harvest Church. That's one of the few cathedrals of the Church of Mother Earth in the kingdom. This church also grasps 2 Beyonder pathways, planter and apothecary. The clues match well, Klein thought as he refolded the note. As the gathering continued, it was unknown whether the female Beyonder with the artisan backing her wasn't present, or she just didn't have any new Beyonder weapons to sell. There were no signs of her, leaving Klein disappointed. Now that he had £509 in hand, he wanted to equip himself nicely. After many transactions were aborted, a man sitting on a stool said in a low voice, "A friend of mine was unfortunately discovered in this investigation. He's imprisoned in a particular Lord of Storm's cathedral by the mandated punishers. I wish to hire a few helpers to rescue him." Eye of Wisdom immediately replied, "Stray dog, give up that thought. A cathedral's mandated punishers and sealed artifacts are enough to destroy all of us here. Your friend's fate has already been decided. Don't let yourself be trapped in the same situation." Stray Dog looked around and realized that no one responded to his request. He couldn't help but thump his thigh, growling, "But what did he do wrong? He's an excellent physician. He's saved a lot of patients and has never hurt anyone. Just because he consumed a potion and became a Beyonder, he's to be imprisoned in a place where the sun never shines. He'll even become an experimental subject for the mandated punishers? Why? Stray Dog's agonized questions echoed in the room. Even the apothecary, who couldn't keep his mouth shut, remained silent. Klein, a former official Beyonder, could only sigh deeply in his heart. Without the spread of the acting method, wild Beyonders are ticking time bombs. But if the acting method is popularized, then the situation would become even more chaotic and bloody. After all, there are the laws of Beyonder characteristics, indestructibility and conservation. In this heavy atmosphere, the gathering came to an end. Klein, who had gotten nothing else, spoke again. Who has revolvers and bullets that come augmented with different Beyonder effects? For example, purification, demon hunting, etc. He didn't specifically fix the caliber of the bullets because he didn't have a gun yet. He could simply wait until he bought the bullets before matching the corresponding gun. In the midst of the silence, a female Beyonder sitting in the same corner replied in a low voice, "I can help you ask, and I'll give you the answer at the next gathering." It seemed to be the lady with the artisan backing her. Klein sighed. All right. After the gathering ended, he didn't return to Minsk Street directly. Instead, he went to East Borough and changed his clothes, heading to the border between North Borough and Hillston Borough. It was where the suspected member of the numinous episcopate, Xueqi Reed, lived. Chapter 303. Rookie North Borough, Olka Street. Xueqi Reed was sitting in a reclining chair in his activity room, lost in thought. In front of him was a fireplace burning with charcoal. As a senior educator at a public school, he received a salary of more than £4 a week, which was enough for a bachelor like him to live quite well. But the clothes he wore at home were patched up, and the teacups on the table looked extremely simple. Without taking off his wig, the most striking thing about Xueqi was his high cheekbones and puffed-up chest, a deformity in which the sternum protruded outwards. On his knee was a book of poems in ancient Saga, but he hadn't flipped a single page even after some time had passed. Xueqi's eyes were unfocused as he stared blankly when he suddenly heard a light chuckle in his ear. "I'm very curious as to why you didn't run and chose to remain at home. Aren't you afraid of the police coming for you?" The voice was low and hoarse, like a boy whose voice was cracking during puberty. Xueqi shuddered and almost jumped out of his reclining chair. He abruptly turned his head to look and saw that there was a figure sitting on the sofa a few steps away from him. The figure wore summer wear, a linen shirt and light trousers. Its face was hazy and indistinct. Who are you? What are you doing here?" Xueqi asked immediately as he gripped the armrest. Klein, who had used his hallucination powers, leaned back, crossed his hands and leisurely said, "Just last night. It should be earlier this morning. I saved all of you." "Saved us?" Xueqi relaxed a little when he realized that the intruder didn't seem to mean any harm. "Why, you're that person in the forest? You took care of the corpse we awakened?" As he spoke, he moved awkwardly, showing obvious fear. "He was able to infiltrate without me realizing it while I was awake. I definitely wouldn't be able to resist." Such thoughts quickly flashed through Xueqi's mind. "You guys are quite lucky that I happened to pass by. Otherwise, there would only be corpses left strewn on the ground in the forest. Corpses that would have been bitten to shreds." Klein laughed. "Answer my previous question. I'm very curious why you stayed at home. Do you know what crimes you've committed?" From the way that he had conducted the resurrection ritual and the reaction he had before and after the ritual, Klein had confirmed that Xueqi was a rookie who didn't have the means to hide his true emotions. Therefore, he intended to only use spirit vision and interrogation to get to the bottom of the matter. At most, he would verify it with divination at the end. I know, secretly buying corpses and robbing corpses from tombs. These are all crimes that can land me in jail for more than 10 years. Moreover, I'll definitely be punished by the church." Xueqi, who didn't look 30, drew a breath and said with a wry smile, "However, as long as I didn't cause too much trouble, those children and their parents wouldn't snitch on me because they also did the same thing. Even if they wanted to get a lighter sentence by helping the investigation by turning themselves in, they would still end up in jail for some time." Xueqi gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Some of the children have already told their parents who I am. They've gotten gangsters to warn me to resign within a week and stay away from school." I agreed. Klein gently nodded his head. "It's a good thing to change environments. Of course, don't do similar things again. Bewitching ignorant children to commit crimes is a heinous act." "I won't. Never again. I never imagined that it would be that dangerous. I just saw that they had the same interests as I did, which was why I wanted to teach them and lead them to search for the secrets of immortality. As for digging graves, many doctors did it a long time ago." Xueqi sighed with some lingering fear. The color of his emotions matches his current state of mind. From the sound of it, he doesn't seem to be a member of the numinous episcopate. Klein thought for a moment, then he bluntly asked, "Where did you learn the spirit dance from?" "Spirit dance? I usually call it the dance of death." Xueqi was taken aback at first before he came to a realization. "An old gentleman taught it to me." "An old gentleman?" Klein pressed. Xueqi's mind turned adrift as he recalled his memories. "He was a vagabond. He fainted in front of my house because of a serious illness. At the time, I didn't know that he was ill. I thought he had simply fallen unconscious, so I helped him home. I gave him a heated towel and applied some ointment for him. After he woke up, he told me not to send him to a hospital or clinic and that death was not the end. I experienced the deaths of my parents and several relatives and was very interested in such things. So, I chatted with him and found out that he had profound knowledge and an admirable philosophy in this area. He seemed to be very satisfied with my curiosity, and even performed a miracle of killing a mosquito and waking it up. This introduction. I've read at least 10 novels with similar openings in my previous life. They were all novels about bringing an old grandpa, who was on the brink of death, home out of kindness, only to have a fortuitous encounter. Klein's mouth twitched. So, you left him at home? Kapusky nodded solemnly and said, yes. If it wasn't for the lack of time, I would have even wanted to become his student. During those few days, he taught me a lot of knowledge and the dance of death. Unfortunately, this period of time was too brief. As soon as I built momentum, he died, leaving behind only a copper whistle. Before he finished his sentence, Kapusky took out an exquisite copper whistle that didn't seem old. This is it. I have one too. It's probably at the ancestor grade though. Klein lampooned, and he thoughtfully asked, how long ago was this? What did he look like? Where did you bury him? Half a year ago. His most obvious feature was his graying hair and red spots on the side of his face. He told me to bury him in the garden out back. Kapusky did a calculation of the dates. It's not Mr. Azek, but the chances are that he's a member of the numinous episcopate and not someone of a low sequence. Klein changed the subject and asked, apart from the spirit dance, you also learned the resurrection ritual? I've only learned half of that ritual. I used some scattered knowledge and folklore to slowly improve it bit by bit, Kapusky answered very honestly. Improved it based on folklore? Oh, that poor black cat. May the goddess bless you. Klein resisted the urge to draw a crimson moon on his chest. What else? He pressed. Yes, and this copper whistle. I think it's the key to communicating with the world beyond our senses. Kapusky raised it and blew at it, sighing. Every time I finish blowing it, I can feel the surroundings turn cold. It's as if someone is watching me and tugging at me. While he was speaking, Klein, who had his spirit vision activated, saw water patterns ripple out from the ground. A cold air spread out alongside it, and the fire and light dimmed a little. Next, a skull with 3 protruding, unfocused eyes emerged from the ground. Around the skull, there were many black jointed tentacles. A tentacle reached out, touching Kapusky's leg and tugged at his clothes from time to time, appearing rather impatient. However, Kapusky didn't respond at all, as though he hadn't noticed. Is this a messenger? The copper whistle is used to summon their corresponding messengers. What's the meaning of you summoning it without giving it a letter? Klein was stunned seeing this scene. At that moment, Kapusky looked at him excitedly. Did you feel it? The surroundings turned cold. The gas lamps have dimmed too. I'm not lying. Someone is watching me and tugging at me. The horrific-looking messenger tried to touch Kapusky, over and over again, but in the end, it didn't receive a letter and went back underground in resignation. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched slightly as he saw this scene. He whispered to himself in his heart, I take back what I said about him. He's not a rookie, he's an utter noob. He's not even a beyonder. I had thought that he was someone who had just stepped through the door of mysticism to learn the basics. But now, it seems like he hasn't even found the location of the door. Corpse collectors of the death sequence pathway can all see ghosts and spirit bodies directly. Combined with how Kapusky had acted by using the copper whistle to command the zombie after the ritual, Klein was convinced that he wasn't lying. He sighed silently. Then, he thought of a question. If I were to write a note and hand it to that messenger, where would it be delivered? A true member of the numinous episcopate? Some senior member? Suppressing this thought, Klein nodded and said, It has indeed turned cold. After replying, he quickly changed the topic. Have you felt anything unusual since the old gentleman's death? Not before, but in the last 2 weeks, I'd have the occasional feeling that someone around me is like a corpse, the kind that can be awoken. Kapusky asked, feeling both curious and afraid. Is it a hallucination? It's in line with what Adel said. He isn't lying. Klein stole a glance at the colors of Kapusky's aura and sincerely told him, I suggest that you go to a cathedral at least 3 times a week for the next 2 months, attend Mass, and listen to preachings. If you do not wish to do so, you can first prepare a grave for yourself. All right, Kapusky answered, feeling disappointed. He thought that it was a manifestation of his improvement. Klein contemplated for a moment and said in a commanding tone, Take me to the old gentleman's corpse. Okay. Kapusky was about to refuse, but then he instantly recognized the reality of the situation he was in. He picked up his tools and led Klein out the back door from the kitchen, into a withered garden, and stopped in front of a slanted tree. Klein stood by his side and watched Kapusky skillfully dig through the dirt, revealing the slate underneath. Having finished with the upper layer, Kapusky used his tools to pry open the slate. Oof! The slate was pressed against the soil that had been dug out just moments ago. The not-so-deep tomb was veiled in the crimson moon's luster that faintly penetrated through the clouds. Kapusky subconsciously looked over when he suddenly let out a miserable scream, retreated a few steps, and fell to the ground. There was no rotting corpse or bones in the tomb. The bottom layer was littered with white feathers, dyed in yellow oil. Chapter 304. Feathers, white feathers? Looking at the corpseless grave, Klein suddenly thought of a word. Angel. In the canon of the 7 major churches, they were filled with legends of angels and saints. The former had one characteristic: a pair of pure white wings on its back, and as many as 2, 3, or even 6 pairs of pure white wings. However, in the blink of an eye, Klein remembered something else Mr. Azik had once described his dream to him, one that seemed to indicate his different lives. One of the scenes was inside a dark mausoleum. There were many opened ancient coffins beside him, and in the coffins, there were corpses with white feathers growing from their backs. Is this a special characteristic of the death pathway, or a strange phenomenon caused by the numinous episcopate? Klein didn't say a word as he restrained his emotions and calmly looked at the white feathers stained with yellowish oil at the bottom of the grave. His initial judgment was that the old gentleman wasn't an angel, as the terrifying sequence 2, or even sequence 1 beyonders, would certainly produce intense effects on their surroundings when they died. For example, the holy artifact, the ashes of a saint which had been stored behind Tinjin City's Chinese gate, would extend almost invisible thin, black, and cold lines so as to seal the people and things around it. Of course, it's also possible that he didn't actually die. He's like Mr. Azik? Klein bent down and picked up 3 white feathers with his black-gloved right hand. He planned to do some divination above the gray fog when he returned home. At that moment, Kapusky came to his senses, scrambled to Klein's side, and looked at the grave with a hint of fear. Where's the body? Klein looked at him and said in a low voice, Maybe he left by himself. He left by himself. Kapusky repeated in horror, now fully aware of how terrible it was for the dead to awaken. His legs trembled as he muttered to himself, but I didn't use the resurrection ritual on him. Klein turned around and looked at him for a few seconds. Death is not the end. Death is not the end. Death is not the end. Kapusky was quite frightened by his own beliefs as he blurted out. Will he come back? Well, the copper whistle had summoned a messenger which probably corresponds to the old gentleman. In other words, by giving the messenger a letter, it is equivalent to sending a letter to the old gentleman, a man who has been dead for almost half a year. I wonder where he went and what kind of state he's in. In response to Kapusky's question, Klein gave him an indifferent reminder. Don't blow that copper whistle again. You mean the copper whistle will draw him back? Kapusky asked in horror. Before Klein could reply, he asked again. Can you help me throw this copper whistle into the Tussock River? If you can't, I'll do it myself. Weren't you interested in the philosophy of death? Klein lampooned as he reached out to take Kapusky's copper whistle. He was planning on sending the dead man a letter when the conditions were right to see what would happen. Of course, the prerequisite for all of this was that he was certain that there wasn't too much danger involved. After instructing Kapusky to fill up the grave again, Klein had a brief exchange with him about the spirit dance and the corresponding mysticism knowledge, enriching his own knowledge. He also asked Kapusky in detail about how he laid the old gentleman's body, facing down, in accordance with his last words. Under certain special circumstances, using spirit dance to replace part of the cumbersome setup for ritualistic magic would be more effective and simple. Seeing that he had achieved his goal, Klein warned Kapusky to stop dabbling with the so-called resurrection rituals. Then, he left the street through the garden and took a long detour via carriage to East Borough. After changing back into his previous clothes, he returned to Minsk Street and entered his bedroom. After a series of actions, he carried the 3 white feathers and Kapusky's copper whistle above the gray fog. Seated in the fool's high-back chair, Klein conjured pen and a paper. He wrote a divination statement he had long thought of, its origins. Then, he held the 3 white feathers and leaned back in his chair. As he chanted silently, Klein entered a dreamland. It was a blurry grayish-white all around him. In this world, there was rich darkness without any light. Suddenly, the darkness was dyed with a crimson shade. A thin, pale hand reached out of the yellowish-brown soil. A figure slowly got up. He didn't lift the stone slab, but he pierced through the soil directly. Under the crimson-red moonlight, the clothes on the figure's back were tattered, and white feathers grew out one after another. The white-haired man tilted his head, revealing the red spots on his face, as well as his blank, emotionless eyes. It began to walk, struggling through the surrounding fences, heading deeper into the darkness until it disappeared far away. The dream shattered and Klein woke up. White feathers sprouted from the back of the corpse. Its state resembles Miss Sharon's, but it's clearly different as well. It gave off a very heavy and corporeal feeling. It seemed to be phasing between a human's body and a spirit's body in a semi-natural and incomplete transformation. An envoy that's connected to the real world and the spirit underworld? Klein tapped the edge of the long table and thought for quite a while. Then, he divined whether there was any danger in using the copper whistle he received from Kapusky at that very moment and received a positive answer. Furthermore, the spirit pendulum moved with great amplitude and high frequencies. It's a pity that I can't directly use the copper whistle above the gray fog. The messenger wouldn't be able to enter at all. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any danger. After muttering to himself, Klein descended through the gray fog and returned to the real world. Early morning, in the relatively refreshing woods in Empress Borough. The apothecary, with a round face who was in his 30s, appeared in a secluded corner and stored the herbs that he had secretly planted into a leather bag that he carried around with him. After completing the mission for the day, he straightened his back, and he began to stretch his body. He mumbled to himself in great satisfaction. Sure enough, my physical constitution has improved. I'm no longer like what I was before, where I was relatively resistant to poisonous elements. However, why is my sequence 8 beast tamer? What does this have to do with apothecary? Well, an apothecary tames and uses plants and parts of animals that have lost their lives, while a beast tamer tames and uses living animals. Does it include beyonder creatures? Then, will my sequence 7 be able to tame and use humans? The old geezer didn't even tell me the name of sequence 7, nor did he give me the formula. When I stabilize, I'll have to try contacting him. The apothecary began punching and kicking to get used to his strengthened body. He only stopped when he was utterly exhausted. Whoosh! While panting, he began to consider a serious problem. How should a beast tamer act? Beast tamer. How should it be done? Look for animals and tame them? As the apothecary was mumbling to himself, he suddenly sensed something and looked towards the artificial lake. There was a huge golden retriever running happily. The large golden retriever seemed to notice his gaze as it suddenly turned its head to look at him. As their gazes met in midair, the large golden retriever froze for a moment. Then, it nimbly turned around and ran away, disappearing without a trace. In the Hall family's luxurious villa, Susie returned to a piano room and sat beside Audrey's feet, her tongue hanging out as she panted heavily. It waited until the blonde girl finished playing a song before it said in fear, "Audrey, I met a scary guy. His eyes were scary." "Is that so? What did he want to do to you?" Audrey asked, curious and concerned. Susie thought for a moment and said, "I don't know either. In short, he's very dangerous." That was my intuition. "What does he look like?" Audrey considered letting the guards and attendants warn the man. "I didn't see him clearly. I feel that he is my natural enemy." Susie replied in all seriousness. "Your natural enemy? A dog-type nemesis?" Audrey gave a reserved smile. "Susie, don't go into those woods for now." "Woof, Audrey, were you in a bad mood?" "I could tell from your piano music," Susie asked. Audrey nodded gently and said, "Yeah. I just received word from Glaint that Furs and Zio wanted to inform me that this evening's gathering has been cancelled. I was originally planning to exchange some Beyonder ingredients for you, and also attempt to come into contact with people from the psychology alchemists," she added silently in her heart. "Why?" Susie asked, puzzled. Audrey thought for a moment before replying. "It's said to be a result of the serial murders." On Saturday morning, Backlund's air was as bad as usual. Klein was trying to make a noodle dish which he loved to eat as a child. For this, he bought higher quality flour, added water and sugar, and mixed it to form a pot of thinned paste. Then, he poured oil into the pot and moistened the surface. After the oil heated up, he scooped up some of the flour paste with his soup spoon and poured it to the side of the pot, spreading it thin. Amidst the sizzling sounds, he spread out several flat pieces of bread, and the fragrance of the flower gradually emanated. When he was almost done, he removed the soft flat pieces of bread, one by one, and put them on the plate. Then, he added water and turned the remaining materials into batter. As soon as he returned to the dining room with the flat bread and paste, Klein impatiently tore off a piece and stuffed it into his mouth. The flat piece of bread only had a rich fragrance of wheat and a sweet taste that whetted his appetite. It was simple and plain, but it was exceptionally delicious. It's the taste from my memories. Klein quickly ate, occasionally drinking a mouthful of the paste. As he was almost done eating and started to slow down, the doorbell suddenly rang. A new commission? Klein took off his napkin, wiped his hands, and got up to go to the door. Before he touched the handle, the image of a visitor appeared in his mind. It was a middle-aged gentleman with white sideburns, a thin face, and an outstanding temperament. It was the private detective, Isengard Stanton, who could get an invitation from the police. Why is he here? Klein opened the door in puzzlement and asked with a smile. Good morning, Mr. Stanton. Is there something? Isengard took off his half-top hat and smiled. Good morning, Mr. Moriarty. I wish to work with you. I believe you're an excellent detective. After all, you previously managed to lead your investigations all the way to East Balham Dock and the Dock Union all by yourself. Cooperate? Klein didn't hide his surprise. Isengard tapped his black cane and replied in a deep voice. To find the serial killer behind the recent chain of serial murders. The police has already offered a reward of £2,000. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.